The Sleeping Beauty Paradox is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of probability and belief. It asks us to think about how information changes our perspective when we don't know all the details. While the paradox is simple to describe, its implications reach deep into questions of logic, reasoning, and how we process uncertainty. The scenario begins with a character, Sleeping Beauty, who agrees to take part in an unusual experiment. On Sunday, she is put to sleep. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. A coin is then flipped to determine what happens next. If the coin lands heads, she is woken up once on Monday and then put back to sleep without further interruptions. If the coin lands tails, she is woken up on Monday, put back to sleep, and woken up again on Tuesday before the experiment ends. Importantly, after each waking, her memory of previous awakenings is erased, so she doesn't know whether it is Monday or Tuesday when she wakes up. When Sleeping Beauty is awakened, she is asked a question: what is the probability that the coin landed heads? This is where the paradox begins. On the surface, it seems straightforward. The coin is a fair coin, so its outcome should have a 50-50 chance. But because her memory is erased, she cannot distinguish between different awakenings. She knows she is awake, but she doesn't know if it is Monday or Tuesday. This uncertainty complicates her reasoning. There are two main perspectives people use to approach this problem: the halfer position and the thirder position. Each side interprets the situation differently, leading to a split in how probability is calculated. The halfer position argues that the coin's fairness remains the key to the problem. Since the coin is equally likely to land heads or tails, the probability of heads is still 50%. Sleeping Beauty's lack of memory doesn't change this, because it doesn't alter the mechanics of the coin flip. According to this view, the experiment is just a clever way to confuse her, but it doesn't provide new information about the coin. The thirder position, however, focuses on the number of times Sleeping Beauty can wake up. If the coin lands heads, she will wake up once. If it lands tails, she will wake up twice. From her perspective, she is equally likely to be in any of these three awakenings. Since two of the three possible situations occur when the coin lands tails, the probability of tails is 2/3, leaving 1/3 for heads. In this view, the experiment changes the way probabilities should be calculated by increasing the weight of outcomes tied to tails. To understand the thirder reasoning more clearly, imagine breaking the problem into three distinct cases: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. When Sleeping Beauty wakes up, she knows she is in one of these three cases. But since she has no memory of other awakenings, she cannot favor one over the others. This creates a situation where each waking moment is equally likely. Because 2 out of the 3 involve the coin landing tails, the probability of tails becomes 2/3. The halfer position pushes back by arguing that the thirder approach incorrectly shifts the focus away from the coin itself. They point out that the coin flip determines the structure of the experiment, not the probability of the coin landing heads or tails. By focusing on the awakenings, the thirder position treats the outcomes as though they are influenced by factors other than the coin, which halfer supporters see as a misunderstanding of the problem. The debate between these two views highlights how difficult it can be to handle probabilities in situations involving limited or distorted information. In traditional probability problems, the sequence of events is usually clear, and probabilities can be calculated without ambiguity. But the Sleeping Beauty paradox introduces memory erasure, creating a unique challenge. It forces us to confront what it means to know something and how that knowledge influences our beliefs. Philosophers and mathematicians have used the Sleeping Beauty paradox to explore broader issues in probability theory. One key question it raises is whether probabilities are tied to events or to the information an observer has about those events. In the halfer view, probabilities are fixed based on the coin flip, regardless of what Sleeping Beauty knows. In the thirder view, probabilities are shaped by her subjective experience of waking up, which creates new information. To make the problem more relatable, consider a real-world analogy. Imagine you enter a lottery with 2 tickets. One ticket enters you into a single drawing, while the other enters you into 2 separate drawings. If you wake up after one of these drawings and you don't know which ticket was used, the situation resembles the paradox. Your odds of winning depend on how you interpret the information you have, whether you focus on the fairness of the lottery or the number of drawings it involves. This analogy helps illustrate why the paradox is so compelling. It shows how subtle changes in perspective can lead to dramatically different conclusions, even when the facts of the situation remain the same. The Sleeping Beauty paradox challenges us to think about how we define probabilities and how our knowledge, or lack of it, affects our reasoning. The paradox also has implications for decision-making in uncertain situations. In real life, we often face scenarios where information is incomplete or ambiguous. For example, when making predictions about the future, we base our probabilities on the information available, which may not tell the whole story. The Sleeping Beauty paradox reminds us that even seemingly straightforward situations can hide complexities that alter how we should think about them. Some have argued that the paradox isn't really a paradox at all, but rather a matter of framing the question correctly. From this perspective, the disagreement between halfers and thirders arises because they are answering different questions. Halfers focus on the probability of the coin flip itself, while thirders focus on the probability of being in a particular waking moment. Clarifying what is being asked may resolve the tension, but it doesn't diminish the paradox's value as a thought experiment. The Sleeping Beauty paradox also intersects with philosophical questions about consciousness and identity. Each time she wakes up, she experiences a new moment of awareness, yet her understanding of the experiment is fragmented by her memory loss. This raises deeper questions about what it means to be the same person across time and how we construct our sense of self when key information is missing. Ultimately, the paradox's enduring appeal lies in its ability to make us question our assumptions. It challenges our intuitive grasp of probability, forcing us to think more carefully about what we mean when we assign likelihoods to events. Whether you lean toward the halfer or thirder position, or find yourself caught between them, the paradox offers a valuable lesson: that our understanding of the world is shaped not only by the facts we observe, but also by the way we interpret those facts. And in a universe filled with uncertainty, that is a lesson worth remembering. The lottery paradox is a fascinating problem in philosophy and logic that challenges how we think about belief, probability, and rationality. It starts with a seemingly simple scenario. Imagine a large lottery with millions of tickets. You know only one ticket will win. It's reasonable to believe that any individual ticket you look at will lose, given the overwhelming odds against it. If there are 1,000,000 tickets, each one has a 99.9999% chance of losing. Based on this, you might say, I believe this ticket will not win for every single ticket. Yet, at the same time, you also know that one ticket must win. This creates a contradiction in your beliefs. How can you rationally believe that each ticket will lose, while also believing that one ticket must win? This paradox pushes us to consider how we form and manage beliefs when dealing with uncertainty. On the surface, it seems easy to justify why you might think each ticket will lose. The chance of any one ticket winning is so small that it feels safe to assume it won't happen. But when you apply this logic to every ticket, you're effectively saying, all the tickets will lose, which contradicts the fact that at least one must win. This is where the paradox lies. Your beliefs about individual tickets, when added together, seem to conflict with your overall belief about the outcome of the lottery. The paradox becomes even more interesting when we think about the nature of belief. Normally, when we say we believe something, we mean that we accept it as true or likely to happen. But beliefs aren't always black and white. They can exist on a spectrum of certainty. For example, you might believe it's going to rain today because the sky is cloudy, but you wouldn't say you're absolutely certain. You'd likely adjust your belief if you saw the sun come out later. The lottery paradox forces us to question how confident we need to be before we claim to believe something. If the chance of any one ticket winning is astronomically low, is it rational to believe it won't win? Or does the mere possibility, no matter how small, make that belief unwarranted? Philosophers have explored various ways to resolve the lottery paradox, but none are without challenges. One approach is to argue that belief should be tied to probability thresholds. For example, you might decide to believe something if it has at least a 95% chance of being true. In the case of the lottery, this would mean it's rational to believe each ticket will lose because the odds of losing are far above 95%. However, this solution doesn't fully address the contradiction. Even if it's rational to believe each individual ticket will lose, believing that all tickets will lose is still irrational because you know that one must win. Another approach involves distinguishing between beliefs about individual events and beliefs about a system as a whole. In the lottery, you might rationally believe that each ticket will lose when considered on its own. But when you step back and view the entire system, you must acknowledge that at least one ticket will win. This perspective suggests that the paradox arises because we're applying the same reasoning to individual tickets and to the lottery as a whole, when in fact, these require different kinds of reasoning. In other words, what's true for one ticket doesn't necessarily translate to what's true for the entire set of tickets. The paradox also raises questions about how we handle conflicting beliefs. In everyday life, it's not uncommon to hold beliefs that seem to contradict each other. For instance, you might believe in the reliability of a friend, but still doubt their ability to follow through on a specific promise. These beliefs don't cancel each other out, but they do reflect a kind of tension. The lottery paradox highlights this tension by showing how conflicting beliefs can emerge from perfectly rational thinking. It challenges us to think about whether our belief systems need to be completely consistent, or if it's possible to hold conflicting beliefs without being irrational. Consider how this paradox might apply to real-world situations beyond lotteries. For example, in scientific research, we often deal with probabilities and uncertainties. A scientist might believe that a new drug will likely fail in clinical trials based on previous data. At the same time, they might also believe that there's a chance it could succeed and revolutionize medicine. These beliefs might seem contradictory, but they reflect the reality of working with uncertainty. The lottery paradox serves as a reminder that belief and probability are complex, and that rational thinking often involves navigating these complexities rather than resolving them entirely. Another real-world example could be found in risk assessment. Suppose you're planning a trip and considering the risks of flying. Statistically, the odds of a plane crash are incredibly low. It's rational to believe that your flight will be safe. However, if you look at all the flights happening around the world, you also know that plane crashes, though rare, do occur. This doesn't mean you're irrational for believing your specific flight will be fine, but it does highlight how probability affects our beliefs about individual events versus the bigger picture. The lottery paradox also invites us to reflect on the limits of human reasoning. Our minds are wired to simplify complex problems, often by focusing on specific details rather than the whole system. In the case of the lottery, it feels natural to evaluate each ticket individually, without fully grappling with how those evaluations add up. This cognitive shortcut helps us make decisions quickly, but it can also lead to paradoxes like this one. By examining these contradictions, we can better understand the strengths and limitations of our reasoning processes. One of the deeper lessons of the lottery paradox is that uncertainty is an inherent part of life. No matter how much we try to predict outcomes or make rational decisions, there will always be situations where probabilities clash with our need for certainty. The paradox doesn't offer a simple solution, but it does encourage us to embrace the complexity of belief. Rather than seeking absolute consistency, we can strive to remain open to new information and adjust our beliefs as needed. The lottery paradox might seem like a purely theoretical problem, but its implications are surprisingly practical. It challenges us to think critically about how we form beliefs, how we handle uncertainty, and how we navigate the tension between individual probabilities and the bigger picture. These are issues we face every day, whether we're deciding what to eat for dinner or grappling with the mysteries of the universe. By engaging with paradoxes like this, we can sharpen our thinking and develop a deeper appreciation for the complexities of rationality. At its core, the lottery paradox reminds us that rationality isn't about eliminating uncertainty, it's about learning to live with it. Life, much like the lottery, is full of improbable outcomes and unexpected surprises. The challenge is not to avoid these uncertainties, but to approach them with clarity, humility, and a willingness to adapt. In doing so, we can navigate the paradoxes of belief with greater confidence and understanding. The altruist's dilemma is a paradox that arises when someone acts out of genuine selflessness, but finds their intentions or actions questioned, misinterpreted, or even counterproductive. Altruism, at its core, is the desire to help others without expecting anything in return. It's an ideal that humanity has long admired, yet it's not as simple as it seems. People often wonder, can anyone truly act without self-interest? And even if they can, does that action always lead to the best outcome? These questions lie at the heart of the altruist's dilemma. Imagine someone dedicating their life to charity, working tirelessly to improve the lives of others. From the outside, their actions might seem entirely noble, but as observers, we may question their motivations. Are they doing it out of a sense of genuine care? Or is there an underlying desire for recognition or status? This skepticism can create a problem for the altruist. If their actions are viewed as self-serving, even indirectly, does it diminish the value of what they've done? And if their efforts are misunderstood or unappreciated, how does that affect their ability or willingness to keep helping? At the same time, there's another layer to the dilemma. Even when intentions are pure, altruistic actions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. For example, giving aid to communities in need might seem like an obvious good, but in some cases it can create dependency, disrupt local economies, or even worsen existing problems. This raises the question, is the act of giving enough, or should the outcomes of that giving also matter? The altruist must grapple with the reality that doing good is not always straightforward. To better understand this, think about the concept of sacrifice. Altruism often involves giving something up, time, money, energy, or opportunities, for the sake of others. While this selflessness is admirable, it can also lead to personal strain. For example, someone who constantly prioritizes others over themselves may eventually experience burnout. If their well-being suffers, their ability to continue helping others diminishes. This creates a difficult balance for the altruist. How much should they sacrifice for others before it begins to harm themselves? At what point does selflessness become unsustainable? One way to explore this idea is through the lens of evolutionary biology. Altruism is not unique to humans. It exists in many animal species. For example, some birds will give warning calls when predators are near, risking their own safety to protect the group. This behavior seems counterintuitive to survival, but it often benefits the species as a whole. In humans, the evolution of altruism is more complex. Acts of kindness can build trust and cooperation, which are essential for social groups to thrive. However, this brings us back to the question of motivation. Are we altruistic because it benefits the group, and by extension ourselves? Or is there something deeper at play? Philosophers have long debated whether true altruism exists. Psychological egoism, for example, argues that all human actions are ultimately driven by self-interest, even if they appear selfless. According to this view, people help others because it makes them feel good, earns them social approval, or aligns with their personal values. On the other hand, ethical altruism suggests that people can genuinely prioritize the well-being of others above their own interests. The altruist's dilemma lies in navigating these conflicting perspectives. If self-interest is always present, does that mean true altruism is impossible? And if it is possible, what does it look like in practice? Let's consider an example. A person sees someone struggling to carry groceries and offers to help. On the surface, this seems like a purely selfless act. But if we dig deeper, we might wonder, did they help because they genuinely cared or because they wanted to feel good about themselves? Does it matter why they helped as long as the result was positive? The altruist's dilemma invites us to reflect on these questions without easy answers. There's also the issue of scale. Helping one person in a direct, tangible way feels rewarding. But when faced with global challenges, poverty, climate change, inequality, altruistic efforts can feel overwhelming or insignificant. This leads to what some call compassion fatigue, where the sheer scale of problems makes individuals feel powerless to make a difference. For the altruist, this can be deeply discouraging. They may question whether their efforts are worth it, or if they're even addressing the right problems. To complicate matters further, altruism can sometimes be met with resistance or criticism. A well-meaning act of generosity might be perceived as intrusive, patronizing, or even harmful. For example, providing aid to a struggling community might unintentionally undermine local leadership or create dependency. These unintended consequences highlight the importance of understanding the context and impact of altruistic actions. It's not enough to act with good intentions. The outcomes must also be considered. Another aspect of the altruist's dilemma is the tension between individual and collective responsibility. When someone takes it upon themselves to help others, they may inadvertently let others off the hook. For example, a person who donates generously to a cause might feel they've done their part, even if the problem requires systemic change. This can create a moral hazard, where altruistic individuals bear the burden of solving problems that should be addressed collectively. The dilemma also raises questions about fairness. Is it fair for some people to give more than others? Should altruism be expected, or should it remain a choice? For example, if one person consistently sacrifices their time and resources to help others, while another does little to contribute, is the first person morally superior? Or are they simply making a personal choice that aligns with their values? These questions highlight the complex interplay between individual ethics and social norms. Despite these challenges, altruism remains a vital part of human experience. It inspires acts of kindness, fosters community, and reminds us of our shared humanity. The altruist's dilemma doesn't diminish the value of altruism. Rather, it encourages us to approach it thoughtfully. By reflecting on the motivations, outcomes, and limitations of our actions, we can strive to do good in ways that are both effective and sustainable. Ultimately, the altruist's dilemma is not about finding perfect answers. It's about embracing the complexities of helping others and recognizing that intention and impact both matter. Altruism is not a simple equation. It's a deeply human endeavor, filled with contradictions and challenges. By acknowledging these tensions, we can better navigate the path of selflessness and strive to make a meaningful difference in the world. The Banach-Tarski paradox is one of the most counterintuitive and mind-bending concepts in mathematics. At its heart, it says something that feels impossible. You can take a solid sphere, break it into a finite number of pieces, and then rearrange those pieces to form two identical spheres, each the same size as the original. This idea is not just strange, it completely defies our everyday understanding of geometry, matter, and even logic. But it's a rigorously proven result, grounded in the principles of set theory and mathematical abstraction. To understand the Banach-Tarski paradox, it helps to start with a key point. This is not about physical objects like a ball you can hold in your hand. It exists purely in the realm of mathematics, where the rules of space and division don't follow the same limitations as the physical world. In the mathematical universe, objects can be infinitely divisible, and properties like volume and shape work differently than we might expect. The paradox exists because of the way we define and manipulate infinity, not because you could ever actually perform this splitting and doubling in real life. Imagine a perfect mathematical sphere. It isn't made of atoms, so it doesn't have a physical structure. Instead, it's a collection of points in three-dimensional space arranged in a way that forms a sphere. Now, the Banach-Tarski theorem says that it's possible to break this sphere into a few parts, 5 to be precise, using a highly abstract process. These parts aren't like slices of an orange or chunks of clay. They're sets of points that are scattered in incredibly complex ways, impossible to visualize. In fact, each piece is so complicated that it's described as non-measurable, meaning it doesn't have a defined volume in the traditional sense. Once the sphere is divided into these non-measurable pieces, something strange happens. By applying rigid motions, rotations, and translations, you can rearrange the pieces to form two complete spheres, each the same size as the original. No volume is added, and no points are lost. It seems like magic, but it's actually the result of the properties of infinite sets and the way space behaves under certain rules. The key to understanding this paradox lies in the mathematical framework that makes it possible. The Banach-Tarski paradox relies on the axiom of choice, a principle in set theory. The axiom of choice states that for any collection of sets, no matter how large or abstract, you can always choose one element from each set, even if there's no explicit rule for making the selection. This principle is crucial in many areas of mathematics, but it also leads to results that feel deeply unintuitive, like the Banach-Tarski paradox. The axiom of choice allows us to define the non-measurable sets that make the paradox work. These sets don't behave like ordinary shapes or objects because they're constructed using infinitely many choices rather than following a concrete step-by-step process. As a result, they don't obey the usual rules of geometry or volume. This is why breaking the sphere into these pieces doesn't destroy its volume, it simply redistributes it in a way that's impossible to replicate in the physical world. To make sense of this, consider how infinity behaves differently from finite quantities. In the real world, if you divide a loaf of bread into pieces and try to rearrange them into two loaves of the same size, you'll always end up short. But in mathematics, infinity doesn't work that way. Infinite sets can be divided and reassembled in ways that preserve their size, even if the process seems nonsensical. For example, the set of all integers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, can be paired one-to-one with the set of all even integers, 2, 4, 6, etc., even though the latter appears to be smaller. This strange property of infinity underlies the Banach-Tarski paradox. Another way to approach the paradox is to think about the nature of the pieces themselves. In everyday terms, we think of parts of an object as having a clear structure and measurable size. But in the Banach-Tarski paradox, the pieces are so fragmented and scattered that they lose these properties. It's as if the points that make up the sphere are stretched and rearranged across space in such a way that traditional ideas of volume no longer apply. These pieces are defined mathematically, but they have no physical counterpart. This abstract nature makes the Banach-Tarski paradox a purely mathematical result, not something you could replicate in the physical world. Physical objects are made of atoms, which are discrete and indivisible at a certain level. You can't split an atom into infinite points, nor can you manipulate matter with the precision required to create the non-measurable sets described in the paradox. Additionally, real-world physics imposes constraints on how objects behave, such as the conservation of mass and energy. These constraints don't exist in the mathematical universe, where the Banach-Tarski paradox lives. Despite its abstract nature, the Banach-Tarski paradox has profound implications for how we think about mathematics, infinity, and the nature of reality. It shows that our intuitive understanding of space and geometry breaks down when we move beyond the finite and into the infinite. It also highlights the power and limitations of the axiom of choice. While this principle is essential for many mathematical proofs, it also leads to results that challenge our sense of logic and possibility. The paradox has sparked debate among mathematicians and philosophers since it was first proposed in 1924 by Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski. Some see it as a fascinating example of how abstract mathematics can defy intuition, while others question whether the axiom of choice should be accepted if it leads to such counterintuitive results. Regardless of these debates, the Banach-Tarski paradox remains a striking reminder of the complexity and beauty of mathematics. To make the paradox more relatable, think of it as a thought experiment that stretches the boundaries of what's possible. It invites us to question the assumptions we make about space, size, and structure. While we can't use the Banach-Tarski paradox to double a basketball or replicate physical objects, it challenges us to explore the limits of our understanding and consider how mathematics reveals truths that go beyond the physical world. In the end, the Banach-Tarski paradox isn't just about dividing and doubling a sphere. It's about the interplay between infinity, abstraction, and logic. It asks us to look beyond the surface of what seems possible and explore the deeper, often paradoxical nature of reality, as described by mathematics. And while we may never fully grasp its implications, the paradox offers a glimpse into the strange and wondrous world of infinite possibilities. The drinker paradox is a fascinating idea from logic that feels counterintuitive at first glance, but is perfectly valid when you examine it carefully. It's one of those concepts that make you pause, scratch your head, and wonder how something so strange can actually make sense. The paradox goes like this. In any bar, there is at least one person, such that if that person is drinking, then everyone in the bar is drinking. At first, this might sound absurd. How can the drinking status of one person possibly dictate the drinking status of everyone else? To understand this better, let's break it down and explore why the statement holds true. The paradox is rooted in formal logic, specifically a field called predicate logic. The key is to focus on the structure of the statement rather than getting caught up in what it seems to imply. The statement doesn't say that there is someone forcing everyone else to drink or that there's some magical influence in play. Instead, it's a careful observation about the relationship between if and then in logical reasoning. When you look closely, you'll see that the truth of the statement is guaranteed regardless of how many people are in the bar or what their drinking habits are. To make sense of this, consider the two possible scenarios. Either everyone in the bar is already drinking, or not everyone is drinking. If everyone in the bar is drinking, then the statement is obviously true. You could pick any person in the bar, and it would be accurate to say that if that person is drinking, then everyone else is also drinking, because they all are. The condition of if that person is drinking is satisfied for anyone you choose, and the result matches the reality. The second scenario is where things get more interesting. If not everyone in the bar is drinking, then there must be at least one person who isn't drinking. Let's call that person Alex. Now consider the statement again. If Alex is drinking, then everyone in the bar is drinking. This might feel strange because Alex isn't drinking, but that's exactly why the statement holds true. The if condition in logic doesn't require Alex to actually be drinking. It only examines what would be true if Alex were drinking. Since Alex isn't drinking, the condition isn't satisfied, and the statement as a whole is automatically true. This is a subtle but important point about how logic works. When the if condition is not met, the entire statement is considered true regardless of the outcome. This might seem counterintuitive because we're used to thinking about cause and effect in everyday situations. In logic, though, the relationship between if and then doesn't depend on causation. It's purely about whether the statement holds up under all possible circumstances. To make this more concrete, let's imagine a small bar with just 3 people, Alex, Ben, and Chris. Suppose Alex isn't drinking, Ben is drinking, and Chris is also drinking. The paradox tells us that there must be someone in the bar such that if that person is drinking, then everyone is drinking. Let's test this. Start with Alex. Since Alex isn't drinking, the if condition is not met, so the statement, if Alex is drinking, then everyone is drinking, is automatically true. Now try Ben. Ben is drinking, and since Chris is also drinking, the statement, if Ben is drinking, then everyone is drinking, is true in this case too. The same goes for Chris. No matter who you choose, the paradox holds. It's worth noting that the paradox isn't making a claim about the real-world dynamics of a bar or how people behave. It's a purely logical construct, designed to show how certain statements can be true in ways that don't align with our intuitive understanding. This is what makes it so fascinating. It challenges our assumptions and invites us to think more carefully about the rules of logic and reasoning. The drinker paradox also highlights the power of formal logic to uncover truths that aren't immediately obvious. In everyday life, we often rely on intuition or common sense to navigate the world, but these tools can sometimes lead us astray when dealing with abstract concepts. By using precise definitions and rules, logic helps us explore ideas that might otherwise remain hidden. One of the reasons the drinker paradox feels so strange is that it forces us to confront the idea of vacuous truth. This concept occurs when a statement is considered true simply because its condition is never met. For example, the statement, "If I am the king of Mars, then pigs can fly," is technically true because the condition "I am the king of Mars" is false. Since the if part isn't satisfied, the statement as a whole is true, regardless of how absurd the conclusion might seem. The drinker paradox relies on this principle to ensure that its statement is always valid. This can be unsettling at first because it seems to clash with how we typically think about truth and meaning. In everyday language, we expect statements to correspond to reality in a straightforward way. Logic, however, operates on a different level. It's less concerned with the content of statements and more focused on their structure and consistency. This distinction allows logic to explore possibilities that might seem strange or counterintuitive at first glance. Another interesting aspect of the drinker paradox is how it illustrates the power of generalization. The statement applies to any group of people, no matter how large or small. It doesn't matter whether there are 3 people in the bar or 300. The logic remains the same. This universality is part of what makes the paradox so compelling. It reveals a truth that holds across all possible scenarios, showing the robustness of logical reasoning. At the same time, the paradox also reminds us of the limits of logic. While it provides a powerful tool for exploring abstract ideas, it doesn't always align with how we experience the world. The drinker paradox is a perfect example of this tension. It's logically sound, but it doesn't offer any practical insights into human behavior or decision-making. Instead, its value lies in how it challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of truth and reasoning. The drinker paradox has also inspired broader discussions in philosophy and mathematics. It's closely related to other logical principles, such as the law of excluded middle, which states that any statement is either true or false, with no middle ground. By examining paradoxes like this one, philosophers and mathematicians can refine their understanding of the foundations of logic and explore new ways of thinking about complex problems. Ultimately, the drinker paradox serves as a reminder of the beauty and complexity of logic. It shows us that truth can take unexpected forms and that our intuition isn't always a reliable guide. By engaging with paradoxes like this, we can expand our perspective and develop a deeper appreciation for the power of logical reasoning. Even if the paradox doesn't have immediate practical applications, it offers a glimpse into the rich world of abstract thought and the surprising ways in which logic can illuminate the mysteries of the universe. Zeno's arrow paradox is one of the most intriguing thought experiments in ancient philosophy. It challenges our basic understanding of motion, time, and reality. At first glance, the paradox may seem straightforward, even trivial, but as you begin to unpack it, the simplicity dissolves into something much deeper. Zeno proposed this paradox as part of a larger argument to question whether motion and change are even possible in the way we perceive them. By focusing on the arrow, Zeno invites us to think carefully about how we understand movement and time. Imagine an arrow in flight. It's released from the bow and is traveling toward a target. To any observer, this seems straightforward. The arrow starts at one point and moves through the air until it reaches another point. It's a natural, everyday process that we see all the time. But Zeno asks us to slow down and consider what's happening at any given instant during the arrow's flight. If you take a single moment in time and freeze it, where is the arrow? It is stationary in that exact moment. In that one slice of time, the arrow does not appear to move. If it's stationary in every single moment that you observe it, how can it ever actually move? To make this clearer, let's think about how we define motion. Motion, in its simplest form, is the act of moving from one place to another over a period of time. But what happens when you break time down into smaller and smaller intervals? At any single point within those intervals, the arrow occupies a specific location in space. If we say that the arrow is in one place at one moment, and it does not change its position in that frozen moment, then the arrow is not moving at that moment. If the arrow is stationary in every individual moment, how can all these stationary moments add up to motion? This idea can feel counterintuitive. After all, we see the arrow moving. We can watch it travel across the sky and hit the target. But Zeno's paradox isn't about what we observe. It's about what happens when we try to describe motion using logic and reasoning. The paradox forces us to question how we think about time and how we divide it. If time is made up of an infinite number of tiny moments, and the arrow is still in each of those moments, then motion seems impossible. But if time isn't made up of moments, what is it? Zeno's paradox doesn't just challenge motion, it challenges how we understand time itself. Let's think about another example to make this concept easier to grasp. Imagine a film reel. A film is made up of individual frames, each showing a single still image. When you play the film, those still images move so quickly that your brain perceives continuous motion. But if you stop the reel on one frame, the picture is frozen. There's no movement in that single frame, just like there's no movement for the arrow in a single instant of time. If motion is an illusion created by how we process continuous frames, is it possible that time works the same way? Are we just perceiving something that isn't truly happening the way we think it is? This paradox is part of a larger argument Zeno made to support the ideas of his teacher, Parmenides. Parmenides believed that change and motion were illusions, and that reality was unchanging and indivisible. Zeno's arrow paradox was one of several paradoxes designed to defend this view by showing that our understanding of motion leads to contradictions. If we accept that the arrow is stationary at every moment, yet still perceive it as moving, then our perception may not match the fundamental nature of reality. To fully appreciate the arrow paradox, we need to think about how people have tried to resolve it over the centuries. One way is to look at how we define time and motion. In the modern world, we often think of time as a continuous flow, rather than a series of frozen moments. Motion, in this view, isn't about being in one place or another at any given instant. It's about how an object's position changes over a continuous interval of time. Using calculus, developed thousands of years after Zeno's time, we can describe motion mathematically. Calculus allows us to work with infinitely small quantities, making it possible to define the arrow's speed at any point during its flight without needing to stop time completely. For example, if you measure the arrow's velocity, you're not looking at a single moment in time. Instead, you're measuring how far the arrow travels over a small interval of time. Velocity connects the arrow's position with the flow of time, resolving the apparent contradiction in Zeno's argument. The paradox assumes that time is a series of frozen instants, but calculus shows that motion and time can be described as continuous rather than discrete phenomena. However, even with the tools of modern mathematics, Zeno's arrow paradox still raises questions that go beyond physics and into philosophy. What is time, really? Is it continuous, like a river flowing smoothly, or is it made up of discrete chunks, like the frames of a film? If it's continuous, how do we reconcile that with the idea of breaking it into smaller and smaller intervals? If it's discrete, how do we explain motion in a way that doesn't involve jumping from one point to another with gaps in between? Some philosophers and physicists suggest that the paradox might reveal something deeper about the universe. In quantum mechanics, for example, particles can exist in states that seem counterintuitive, like being in multiple places at once or moving and not moving simultaneously. These ideas echo some of the questions raised by Zeno's paradox, suggesting that our everyday experience of motion and time might not fully capture the complexities of reality. Others argue that Zeno's paradoxes are less about proving that motion is impossible and more about showing the limitations of our reasoning. When we try to divide time or motion into infinitely small parts, we run into problems because our logic isn't equipped to handle infinity. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of how we think about the world and challenges us to find better ways of understanding it. In the end, Zeno's arrow paradox isn't just a puzzle about an arrow, it's a question about how we understand the universe. It challenges us to think carefully about motion, time, and perception, and it reminds us that even the most ordinary experiences can reveal profound mysteries. When we watch an arrow fly through the air, we might not think about the nature of time or the logic of motion. But Zeno's paradox invites us to look closer, to slow down, and to question what we take for granted. The paradox may never have a definitive solution, and that's part of what makes it so compelling. It encourages us to keep asking questions, to explore the boundaries of what we know, and to embrace the possibility that the universe is far stranger than it seems. Whether we see the arrow as moving or stationary, Zeno's paradox leaves us with a sense of wonder about the nature of reality itself. A greedy algorithm is a method used to solve problems by making the locally optimal choice at each step, with the hope that these individual choices will lead to a globally optimal solution. It is simple, intuitive, and often works well for a range of problems. But there's a paradox at the heart of greedy algorithms that makes them both powerful and limited. They are efficient and straightforward, yet they can lead to solutions that are not the best possible. This paradox arises because what seems best in the moment does not always translate into what is best overall. Imagine you're trying to climb a mountain in a dense fog. You can only see a few steps ahead, so you decide to always take the steepest upward path, figuring it will get you to the top fastest. At first, this approach works well. Each step takes you higher, and you feel like you're making progress. But at some point, you might find yourself stuck on a smaller peak, unable to see the larger mountain just beyond the fog. By focusing only on the immediate gain, always choosing the steepest incline, you may have missed the bigger picture. This is the essence of the greedy algorithm paradox. One way to understand this paradox is by looking at the classic example of coin change. Imagine you need to make change for a certain amount using coins of different denominations. Suppose you have coins worth 1, 3, and 4 units. To make change for 6 units, a greedy approach would pick the largest coin possible at each step. First, you'd choose the 4-unit coin, leaving 2 units to account for. Then you'd choose 2 1-unit coins. In total, you'd use 3 coins. But there's a better solution. By choosing 2 3-unit coins instead, you'd only need 2 coins in total. The greedy algorithm failed because it didn't consider the long-term implications of its immediate choices. The paradox becomes even more striking when greedy algorithms succeed in some cases and fail in others. For example, if the coin denominations were 1, 5, and 10 units, the greedy algorithm would always give the optimal solution. To make change for 18 units, it would pick 1 10-unit coin, 1 5-unit coin, and 3 1-unit coins, for a total of 5 coins. This solution is the best possible. The difference lies in the structure of the problem. When the denominations are carefully aligned, the greedy approach works perfectly. But when the structure is more complex, as in the earlier example, the algorithm struggles. The real-world implications of this paradox are profound. Greedy algorithms are used in many fields, from scheduling tasks to routing network traffic to compressing files. Their simplicity makes them attractive, especially when speed is critical. For instance, if a company wants to assign workers to tasks as quickly as possible, a greedy algorithm might assign each worker to the task that pays the most at the moment. This approach works well if tasks are independent, but it can fail if tasks are interconnected. By focusing on immediate rewards, the algorithm might assign workers to tasks that leave better-paying options unavailable later. Consider the traveling salesman problem, a classic example in computer science. The goal is to find the shortest route that visits a list of cities and returns to the starting point. A greedy approach might suggest visiting the nearest unvisited city at each step. While this seems logical, it often results in a route that is far from optimal. The salesman might end up crisscrossing regions unnecessarily, simply because the algorithm prioritized short-term gains over long-term efficiency. The greedy algorithm fails because it doesn't look ahead or evaluate the overall problem holistically. To make this clearer, imagine you're playing a game that involves collecting treasure from a series of islands. Each island has a certain amount of treasure, and you have a limited amount of time to gather as much as possible. A greedy strategy would have you always visit the island with the largest amount of treasure next. At first, this might seem like the best approach, but as time runs out, you might find yourself stuck far from islands that could have collectively offered more treasure. The paradox here is that the greedy algorithm's focus on immediate rewards blinds it to better solutions. One of the most famous cases where a greedy algorithm works perfectly is Kruskal's algorithm for finding a minimum spanning tree in a graph. In this problem, the goal is to connect all points, or nodes, in a network with the smallest total connection cost. The greedy approach works by always adding the smallest available connection that doesn't create a cycle. Remarkably, this method guarantees the optimal solution. The paradox here is that while greedy algorithms often fail for global optimization problems, they can excel in specific contexts where the structure of the problem aligns with the algorithm's logic. Another example is Huffman coding, a technique used in data compression. The goal is to assign shorter codes to more frequent items and longer codes to less frequent ones, minimizing the total length of the encoded data. The greedy approach builds the code step by step, combining the two least frequent items at each stage. This method produces the optimal solution, demonstrating that the paradox doesn't always apply. Greedy algorithms can be brilliant in the right context. But what makes greedy algorithms fail? The key lies in their short-sightedness. By focusing only on the best option at each step, they ignore the bigger picture. This short-sightedness is acceptable when the problem's structure ensures that local decisions lead to global optima, as in Kruskal's algorithm. But in problems like the traveling salesman or the coin change example, the lack of foresight leads to suboptimal results. The greedy algorithm paradox reminds us of the importance of understanding the problem we're trying to solve. In some cases, a greedy approach is not just sufficient, but optimal. In others, it's a shortcut to failure. The challenge lies in recognizing the difference. When the stakes are high, relying solely on a greedy algorithm can be risky. It's often necessary to consider alternative strategies, such as dynamic programming or backtracking, that take a more comprehensive view of the problem. Ultimately, the paradox teaches us a broader lesson about decision-making. In life, as in algorithms, focusing only on immediate rewards can lead to long-term problems. Whether you're managing resources, planning a project, or navigating a personal challenge, it's worth asking, am I making the best decision for the moment or the best decision overall? The greedy algorithm offers speed and simplicity, but it's not always the best guide. By thinking ahead and considering the broader context, we can avoid the traps of short-term thinking and find solutions that truly stand the test of time. The falling elevator paradox is a thought experiment that explores what might happen to a person inside an elevator if the elevator were to fall freely under the force of gravity. At first glance, it seems straightforward. A person would simply fall with the elevator, both accelerating at the same rate due to gravity. But when you consider the implications more deeply, the situation becomes more complex and raises questions about how forces, inertia, and perception interact. To understand the paradox, imagine yourself standing in an elevator. On a normal day, when the elevator is stationary or moving smoothly, you feel the floor pushing up against your feet. This upward force balances the downward force of gravity, keeping you in place. Now, picture the cable holding the elevator snapping. Without the cable's tension to keep it in place, the elevator would start to fall freely, accelerating downward at the same rate as gravity. This is where the paradox begins to take shape. If the elevator and everything inside it, including you, are in free fall, then you and the elevator are both accelerating at the same rate. From your perspective, it would feel as though gravity has disappeared. The floor beneath you is no longer pushing up, because the elevator is falling away at the same speed as you are. This creates a condition physicists call weightlessness, where you experience no sensation of weight because nothing is pressing against you. Essentially, you would float inside the elevator, just as astronauts float in the microgravity of space. The key here is that the forces acting on you and the elevator are perfectly matched, leaving no force for you to sense. But there's more to the falling elevator paradox than the experience of weightlessness. It also raises questions about whether you could survive such an event and what would happen when the elevator inevitably hits the ground. Some people suggest that if you were able to jump at the last moment before impact, you might save yourself from serious injury. This idea is based on the belief that jumping would counteract the downward motion of the elevator, reducing the force of the collision. However, physics tells a different story. When the elevator is falling, it accelerates toward the ground at approximately 9.8 meters per second squared, the acceleration due to gravity. You, as a person inside the elevator, are falling at the same rate. Even if you were to jump just before the elevator hits the ground, the relative speed you could achieve by jumping is negligible compared to the speed at which you and the elevator are falling. For example, a strong jump might propel you upward at a speed of about 3 meters per second. If the elevator is falling at 50 meters per second, your jump would only slightly reduce your impact speed to 47 meters per second. The reduction is too small to make a significant difference, meaning the impact would still be catastrophic. This part of the paradox highlights the limitations of human strength and reaction time in extreme situations. It also underscores the fact that jumping would not change the fundamental forces at play. Gravity acts on both you and the elevator throughout the fall, and your motion relative to the elevator doesn't alter the overall physics of the situation. The energy involved in the collision depends on the velocity of the elevator and your mass, both of which remain largely unaffected by your last-second jump. Another aspect of the falling elevator paradox involves the role of air resistance. In a vacuum, the elevator and its contents would fall freely, experiencing no resistance to their motion. But in the real world, air resistance plays a role. As the elevator accelerates downward, it encounters air molecules which exert an opposing force. Over time, this resistance can limit the elevator's speed, creating what's known as terminal velocity. Terminal velocity occurs when the downward force of gravity is balanced by the upward force of air resistance, preventing further acceleration. While terminal velocity might reduce the final impact speed, it would still be far too high for a human to survive. Some modern elevators are designed with safety systems to prevent such scenarios. For example, elevators often have emergency brakes that engage if the cable snaps. These brakes use mechanical friction to slow the elevator's descent, preventing free fall. Additionally, modern elevator shafts are built with shock-absorbing materials at the base to minimize the force of impact if an elevator were to fall. These innovations are designed to address the practical dangers of a falling elevator, but they don't change the fundamental principles behind the paradox itself. The paradox also invites comparisons to other situations where free fall occurs. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, for example, experience weightlessness because the station is in a continuous state of free fall around the Earth. Although they are moving at an incredible speed, the curvature of the Earth means they never collide with the surface. This creates an environment where they feel weightless, similar to how you would feel inside a falling elevator. However, the key difference is that the station's free fall is carefully controlled, whereas the elevator's fall ends abruptly when it hits the ground. Some variations of the falling elevator paradox explore hypothetical ways to survive. One suggestion involves lying flat on the floor of the elevator during the fall. The idea here is to distribute the force of impact more evenly across your body, potentially reducing the risk of injury. While this approach might offer a slight advantage compared to standing upright, it is unlikely to make a meaningful difference in the event of a high-speed collision. The forces involved are simply too great for human survival without additional protective measures. The falling elevator paradox is also a useful way to think about broader concepts in physics, such as inertia and relative motion. Inertia, a principle first described by Isaac Newton, refers to an object's tendency to resist changes in its state of motion. In the case of the falling elevator, both you and the elevator share the same motion, so you don't feel any forces acting on you relative to the elevator. This is why you experience weightlessness, even though gravity is still pulling both you and the elevator downward. Relative motion also plays a role in understanding the paradox. From the perspective of someone outside the elevator, you and the elevator are both accelerating toward the ground. But from your perspective inside the elevator, it feels as though you are stationary, floating in midair. This difference in perspective is a fundamental aspect of how motion is experienced and measured, emphasizing that motion is always relative to a specific frame of reference. The falling elevator paradox challenges us to think about the nature of forces, motion, and survival in extreme scenarios. It shows that our everyday intuition about jumping, weight, and gravity doesn't always align with the principles of physics. By exploring these ideas, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the universe and the remarkable ways in which physics governs our world. The paradox may remain a thought experiment for most of us, but its lessons apply far beyond the confines of an elevator shaft. The Abilene Paradox is a situation where a group of people collectively decide on a course of action that none of them truly want or support. It's a breakdown in communication and understanding, often driven by the desire to avoid conflict or to conform to perceived expectations. The paradox highlights how decisions made in groups can sometimes lead to outcomes that no one individually intended or desired. It's a common phenomenon in organizations, families, and even friendships, often arising because people assume they know what others want, even when that assumption is incorrect. To understand the Abilene Paradox, imagine a family sitting at home on a hot summer day. They're comfortable and enjoying each other's company. Someone casually suggests that they could all drive to a diner in a nearby town, Abilene, for lunch. One by one, each family member agrees, even though none of them really want to go. They pile into the car, endure the sweltering heat and a long drive, and finally arrive at the diner. The food is mediocre, the heat is exhausting, and the entire trip feels unpleasant. On the way home, someone mentions how they didn't really want to go in the first place. To their surprise, everyone else admits they felt the same way. It turns out no one wanted to go, but everyone went along with the idea because they thought everyone else was in favor of it. This is the essence of the Abilene Paradox. It shows how people can act against their own preferences and best interests, not because of disagreement, but because of a lack of honest communication. In the case of the family, each person feared rocking the boat or disappointing others. They assumed that speaking up would create conflict or make them appear unsupportive. Instead, they chose to conform, leading to a collective decision that no one really wanted. The paradox often emerges in group settings where people feel pressure to maintain harmony. For example, in workplace meetings, team members might stay silent rather than express concerns about a proposed idea. They may fear being seen as negative, difficult, or out of touch. If everyone feels this way but doesn't speak up, the group might move forward with a plan that has little actual support. Over time, this can lead to frustration, resentment, and even failure, as decisions are made based on assumptions rather than genuine consensus. One of the key drivers of the Abilene Paradox is the human desire to avoid conflict. Many people feel uncomfortable disagreeing with others, especially in group settings. They may worry about damaging relationships, appearing confrontational, or being isolated. Instead of voicing their true thoughts, they suppress their opinions and go along with what they believe the group wants. Ironically, this avoidance of conflict often creates a different kind of tension, an unspoken dissatisfaction that can undermine trust and collaboration. Another factor is the assumption that others have stronger opinions or preferences than we do. In the Abilene example, each family member might have thought, "I don't really want to go, but everyone else seems to want this, so I'll agree." This assumption can spiral, with each person silently deferring to others who are also silently deferring. Without open communication, the group ends up making a decision based on imagined consensus rather than actual agreement. The Abilene Paradox also reflects the challenge of self-awareness and communication. It's not always easy to recognize our true preferences or to articulate them clearly. In group settings, people may feel unsure about their own thoughts or worry that their perspective is invalid. This hesitation can lead to silence, creating a vacuum that others fill with assumptions. Over time, these dynamics reinforce the paradox, as individuals prioritize group harmony over honest expression. Breaking out of the Abilene Paradox requires creating an environment where people feel safe to share their true thoughts. This starts with fostering open communication and trust. For example, a manager leading a team meeting could explicitly invite dissenting opinions by saying, "I want to hear if anyone has concerns or sees things differently." By normalizing disagreement and showing that it's valued, leaders can reduce the fear of conflict and encourage honest dialogue. It also helps to ask questions that clarify individual preferences. In the family scenario, someone could have asked, Does anyone really want to go to Abilene, or are we all just okay staying here? This kind of direct question can disrupt the assumption spiral and bring hidden preferences to the surface. Similarly, in a workplace setting, asking team members to rate their level of agreement on a scale or provide anonymous feedback can reveal whether a decision truly has support. Another way to address the paradox is by promoting a culture of accountability. When individuals feel responsible for their input and decisions, they are more likely to speak up. For instance, if a team member knows their silence could lead to a flawed decision, they may feel more motivated to voice their concerns. Encouraging personal accountability helps shift the focus from group conformity to individual contribution. At its core, the Abilene Paradox is about the tension between individual and group dynamics. It reveals how easily we can fall into patterns of conformity, even when it goes against our own interests. By understanding this paradox, we can take steps to prevent it from shaping our decisions. This means cultivating awareness, fostering open communication, and challenging assumptions. The lessons of the Abilene Paradox extend beyond group settings. On a personal level, it encourages us to reflect on our own choices and motivations. How often do we agree to things we don't truly want, simply to avoid discomfort or conflict? How often do we assume we know what others want without asking them directly? By questioning these patterns, we can make more intentional decisions and build stronger relationships. Ultimately, the Abilene Paradox reminds us of the importance of authenticity. Honest communication is the foundation of meaningful collaboration and connection. When we express our true thoughts and listen openly to others, we create the conditions for real consensus and shared purpose. This doesn't mean avoiding conflict at all costs. It means embracing it as a natural and necessary part of decision-making. Through this process, we can move beyond the paradox and make choices that reflect our genuine values and priorities. The Traveler's Paradox is one of those fascinating ideas that captures our imagination while also challenging how we think about time, reality, and logic. At its core, it involves a contradiction. How can someone change the past if their actions in the past directly affect their ability to travel there in the first place? This paradox, also called the Grandfather Paradox, has been explored in science fiction, philosophy, and even physics. It raises questions about how time works and whether the past is something we can ever truly alter. To understand the Traveler's Paradox, imagine a scenario where someone builds a time machine and travels to the past. They go back, for example, to the early 20th century. Once there, they make a decision to do something dramatic, like prevent the invention of the time machine itself. If they succeed, they stop the invention from ever happening, which means the time machine they used to travel back in time would never have existed. If the time machine was never invented, how could they have traveled back in the first place? And if they couldn't travel back, how could they have stopped its invention? This creates a logical loop, one that seems impossible to resolve. The paradox forces us to think about cause and effect in a way that feels unnatural. In our everyday lives, causes always come before effects. If you drop a glass, it shatters. The glass doesn't shatter first and then fall to the ground afterward. This linear sequence of events feels natural to us because it's how time works in the world as we experience it. But the Traveler's Paradox suggests a situation where causes and effects overlap and interfere with each other. It's a situation where changing one thing creates a ripple effect that loops back on itself, leading to contradictions. The paradox also raises questions about whether time is fixed or flexible. If time is fixed, then the past, present, and future are all set in stone. No matter what you do, you can't change the events that have already happened. If this is true, a time traveler could never truly alter the past. They might be able to observe it or even participate in it, but their actions would always fit into the timeline in a way that preserves the events as they originally happened. In this view, the paradox doesn't arise because the traveler can't actually do anything that would disrupt the timeline. On the other hand, if time is flexible and the past can be changed, the paradox becomes a real problem. Any change to the past could create a cascade of effects that alter the present and the future in unpredictable ways. For instance, imagine a time traveler goes back to prevent a major historical event. like a war. If they succeed, the world they return to might be completely different. In this new world, they might never have had a reason to travel back in time to stop the war in the first place. The moment they change the past, they undermine the very reason they went back, creating a loop that seems impossible to resolve. Some theories attempt to resolve the paradox by suggesting that any changes to the past create a new timeline or parallel universe. In this view, the act of altering the past splits the timeline into two, one where the original sequence of events happened, and another where the time traveler's actions created a new version of history. For example, if the traveler prevents the invention of the time machine, they might return to a timeline where the machine was never invented, but the original timeline where it was invented still exists separately. This idea avoids the logical contradictions of the paradox by keeping the timelines distinct from one another. Another way to think about the paradox is to consider the concept of self-consistency. This idea suggests that even if you travel back in time, your actions must be consistent with the events that have already happened. For instance, if you went back to meet a historical figure, you couldn't do anything that would fundamentally change their life in a way that contradicts history as you know it. Any actions you take would have already been part of the timeline all along, meaning the paradox never arises because your presence in the past was always accounted for. To make this more relatable, consider a scenario where a time traveler goes back to warn a scientist about an upcoming disaster. The scientist listens to the warning and takes precautions, which ultimately prevent the disaster. However, in doing so, they create the conditions that made the time traveler go back in the first place. The traveler's actions are part of a self-consistent loop, where their presence in the past ensures that history unfolds in a way that aligns with what they already know. While this doesn't eliminate the strange logic of the situation, it avoids outright contradictions. The traveler's paradox isn't just a thought experiment. It has implications for how we think about the nature of time itself. In physics, the laws of nature don't necessarily forbid time travel. Einstein's theory of relativity, for example, allows for the possibility of closed time-like curves, paths through space and time that loop back on themselves. While this doesn't mean time travel is possible with our current technology, it suggests that the universe might not outright prevent it. However, even if time travel is theoretically possible, the paradox highlights the practical and logical challenges it would create. If someone could change the past in a way that disrupts their ability to travel there, it suggests that some mechanism must exist to prevent such contradictions. This has led to speculation about chronological protection, a hypothetical principle that would prevent time travel or limit its effects in ways that preserve the consistency of the timeline. In popular culture, the traveler's paradox has been explored in countless ways. Movies, books, and TV shows often use it as a central plot device, creating dramatic tension by showing how characters grapple with the consequences of their actions in the past. From classics like Back to the Future to more complex stories like Interstellar, the paradox provides a way to explore questions about destiny, free will, and the nature of reality. While the paradox is fascinating, it's also important to remember that it's rooted in our current understanding of time and logic. If our understanding of these concepts changes, the paradox itself might dissolve. For example, if time isn't linear but instead exists as a series of interconnected moments, the idea of altering the past might not even make sense. Instead, every moment could influence every other moment in ways we can't fully comprehend. The traveler's paradox invites us to question how much we really understand about time and causality. It forces us to confront the limits of our intuition and to consider possibilities that seem to defy logic. Whether or not time travel ever becomes a reality, the paradox will continue to spark curiosity and inspire new ways of thinking about the mysteries of the universe. In the end, it's not just about solving the paradox, it's about exploring the questions it raises and the ideas it helps us discover. Procrastination is a behavior almost everyone experiences at some point, yet it remains one of the most puzzling aspects of human nature. It's a paradox because people often delay tasks they genuinely want or need to complete, even though they know it will lead to stress or regret later. Why do we put off things that matter to us? Why do we choose short-term comfort over long-term benefit, despite knowing the consequences? The procrastination paradox lies in this gap between intention and action. It's not about laziness or lack of discipline. Instead, it's a deeper struggle with time, priorities, and emotional responses. Imagine someone sitting down to complete an important project. The deadline is approaching, and they know the task requires immediate attention. But instead of starting, they find themselves scrolling through their phone or tidying up their desk. They justify these small distractions as necessary preparations, but deep down, they're avoiding the real work. This avoidance creates a cycle. The more they delay, the more the task looms over them, creating anxiety. That anxiety makes it even harder to begin, leading to more procrastination. This feedback loop traps people, and they often wonder why they're unable to break free. The procrastination paradox becomes clearer when we understand how the brain works. Our brains prioritize short-term rewards over long-term goals. When faced with a task that feels challenging or overwhelming, the brain naturally seeks relief from that discomfort. This relief often comes in the form of distractions, like watching a video, chatting with a friend, or even doing other less pressing tasks. These activities offer a quick dopamine boost, temporarily making us feel better. However, this short-term comfort often leads to long-term stress when deadlines approach, and the unfinished task still waits. Another aspect of procrastination involves how people perceive time. When a deadline feels far away, the brain tends to underestimate its urgency. Tasks seem distant and manageable in the future, so there's little motivation to start today. But as the deadline gets closer, time suddenly feels compressed, and the task that once seemed simple now feels insurmountable. This shift in perception often triggers a frantic rush to finish, leading to stress and sometimes subpar results. Procrastination thrives in this disconnect between how we view time in the moment and how we experience it as deadlines approach. For some, procrastination stems from a fear of failure. The thought of starting a task can bring up doubts about their abilities. What if the work isn't good enough? What if others judge it harshly? To avoid these uncomfortable feelings, they delay starting. Ironically, this delay often increases the likelihood of failure because it reduces the time available to do the task well. This fear-based procrastination can feel paralyzing, and it often leads to feelings of guilt and frustration. On the other hand, some people procrastinate because of perfectionism. They set such high standards for their work that starting feels overwhelming. They fear making mistakes or creating something that doesn't meet their expectations. To protect themselves from this disappointment, they delay starting altogether. In their minds, it's easier to put it off than to face the possibility of not achieving perfection. A common misconception about procrastination is that it's purely a problem of poor time management. While time management plays a role, procrastination is more about emotional regulation than about the clock. People procrastinate because starting a task feels uncomfortable. Whether it's boredom, fear, or self-doubt, the emotions tied to the task create resistance. Managing procrastination, then, isn't just about scheduling time. It's about addressing the emotional barriers that prevent action. One way to understand this is by looking at how small tasks often feel easier to complete than larger ones. If someone is asked to reply to a quick email, they're likely to do it right away. But if they're tasked with writing a lengthy report, they might delay for hours, days, or even weeks. The difference isn't just about the time required, it's about the emotional weight of the task. Larger tasks feel more intimidating, so people naturally avoid them. Breaking these larger tasks into smaller, manageable steps can reduce this resistance and make it easier to start. Consider the concept of momentum. Once people start a task, they often find it's not as difficult as they imagined. The act of beginning creates a sense of progress, which makes it easier to continue. But getting to that starting point is where procrastination takes hold. This is why small initial actions, like writing one sentence or organizing materials, can be so powerful. They lower the emotional barrier to starting and create a pathway to continued effort. It's also helpful to acknowledge that procrastination isn't always bad. Sometimes, delaying a task allows for reflection or better planning. For example, creative tasks often benefit from periods of incubation, where ideas can develop unconsciously before being put into action. Procrastination becomes a problem when it leads to unnecessary stress, missed opportunities, or diminished results. Recognizing the difference between productive delay and harmful procrastination can help people use their time more effectively. For many, the key to overcoming procrastination lies in understanding their own patterns and triggers. Self-awareness is a powerful tool. When people recognize what causes them to procrastinate, whether it's fear, perfectionism, or a lack of clarity, they can take steps to address those barriers. For example, someone who feels overwhelmed by a large project might benefit from breaking it into smaller, specific tasks. Someone who fears failure might find it helpful to remind themselves that imperfect action is better than no action at all. Another effective approach is to change how tasks are framed. Instead of focusing on the difficulty of a task, people can focus on the benefits of completing it. For instance, instead of thinking, "I have to finish this boring report," they might think, "Completing this report will help me meet my goals." This shift in perspective can reduce resistance and make the task feel more meaningful. It's also worth considering how external factors influence procrastination. The modern world is full of distractions, from social media to endless streams of entertainment. These distractions make it easier than ever to avoid difficult tasks. Creating an environment that minimizes these distractions can make a significant difference. For example, turning off notifications, setting specific work times, or using tools to block distracting websites can help create a focus-friendly space. Ultimately, the procrastination paradox reveals how deeply human this behavior is. It's not about weakness or failure, it's about the complex ways people navigate time, emotions, and priorities. By understanding the underlying causes of procrastination and developing strategies to address them, people can break free from its grip. They can move from a cycle of delay and regret to one of action and progress. Procrastination is a reminder that people are not always logical creatures. They make decisions based on emotions, habits, and perceptions of time. But this doesn't mean they're powerless. By taking small, intentional steps, they can overcome procrastination and create a life where action aligns more closely with intention. Each moment offers an opportunity to start anew, and progress begins with the simple decision to take that first step. The paradox of tolerance is an idea that challenges how we think about freedom and coexistence. It suggests that in order to maintain a tolerant society, we cannot tolerate intolerance. At first glance, this may seem contradictory. If a society claims to value tolerance, shouldn't it accept all views, even intolerant ones? The answer, as this paradox demonstrates, is no. Tolerating intolerance can create conditions where tolerance itself is destroyed. This idea forces us to consider the limits of tolerance and how they are necessary for preserving a functioning society. The philosopher Karl Popper is credited with articulating the paradox of tolerance. He argued that unlimited tolerance would ultimately lead to the end of tolerance. If intolerant ideas and behaviors are allowed to spread unchecked, they can undermine the very foundation of a tolerant society. Intolerant groups, given enough power, often seek to silence or oppress others. This creates an environment where open dialogue, mutual respect, and diversity can no longer thrive. Therefore, a society that values tolerance must recognize the need to set boundaries against those who would harm its core principles. To understand the paradox, it helps to imagine a scenario. Picture a community that values free speech and diversity of thought. This community welcomes all viewpoints, even controversial or unpopular ones. However, over time, a group emerges within the community that promotes intolerance. They use their freedom of speech to spread hate and division, targeting others based on race, religion, or other differences. If the community tolerates this behavior, the intolerant group may grow in influence. As their power increases, they might demand restrictions on the very freedoms that allowed them to rise in the first place. They could call for silencing those who disagree with them, or worse, seek to eliminate certain groups altogether. In this scenario, the community's commitment to unlimited tolerance has enabled intolerance to flourish, threatening the rights and safety of everyone else. This paradox doesn't mean that we should suppress every opinion that makes us uncomfortable or challenges our beliefs. Tolerance requires us to accept a wide range of perspectives, even ones we disagree with. The key distinction lies in how those perspectives are expressed and what their goals are. Ideas that seek to challenge existing norms or spark debate are not the same as ideas that aim to harm others or dismantle the freedoms that enable debate in the first place. When intolerance crosses into promoting harm, violence, or oppression, it moves beyond the bounds of what a tolerant society can accept. The challenge lies in defining where to draw the line. What counts as harmful intolerance versus uncomfortable disagreement? Different societies and individuals might answer this question differently. For example, some may argue that hate speech falls squarely under harmful intolerance because it fosters an environment of fear and discrimination. Others may contend that the best way to counter hate speech is not through suppression, but through open debate and counter-arguments. Both sides wrestle with the same question: how do we prevent intolerance from destroying tolerance without becoming intolerant ourselves? A good way to think about this issue is to focus on actions rather than ideas. People can hold intolerant beliefs without necessarily acting on them in ways that harm others. For example, someone might hold prejudiced views in private, but never advocate for or engage in violence or discrimination. In this case, their beliefs, while intolerant, do not pose an immediate threat to the broader community. However, when those beliefs translate into actions, such as inciting violence, spreading dangerous propaganda, or implementing discriminatory policies, they cross the line into harmful intolerance. History provides many examples of what can happen when intolerance is allowed to grow unchecked. The rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany, illustrates this point vividly. Initially, the Nazi Party was a small fringe group that used the freedoms of a democratic society to spread its message. Over time, as they gained power, they dismantled those same freedoms, silencing dissent and persecuting those who didn't align with their ideology. The tragedy of this period serves as a stark reminder that tolerating intolerance can have devastating consequences. At the same time, it's important to remember that responding to intolerance doesn't always mean censorship or suppression. Education, dialogue, and social accountability can be powerful tools for addressing intolerant behavior. By fostering an environment where people are encouraged to question and reflect on their views, we can challenge intolerance in ways that strengthen the fabric of society rather than tear it apart. For instance, public campaigns that promote empathy and understanding can counteract the spread of hate without resorting to authoritarian measures. There's also a practical side to the paradox of tolerance. In any society, some level of enforcement is necessary to maintain order and protect individual rights. This could mean enforcing laws against hate crimes, regulating harmful propaganda, or ensuring that public discourse remains respectful and constructive. These measures are not inherently intolerant. Rather, they are tools to safeguard the freedoms and values that make a tolerant society possible. Without these safeguards, the very idea of tolerance could collapse under the weight of unchecked intolerance. Another way to think about this paradox is through the lens of boundaries. Every value we hold requires limits to preserve it. For example, freedom of speech does not include the right to shout fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. Similarly, tolerance does not require us to accept actions or ideas that threaten the safety and well-being of others. Boundaries are not a betrayal of tolerance, they are its protection. Some critics argue that the paradox of tolerance is used as an excuse to suppress dissent or unpopular opinions. They worry that labeling something as intolerant could become a way to silence legitimate criticism or debate. This is a valid concern, and it highlights the need for clear and consistent criteria when addressing intolerance. The goal should always be to strike a balance, protecting the rights and safety of the community without stifling the diversity of thought that tolerance seeks to uphold. In modern times, the paradox of tolerance is especially relevant in the context of social media and online platforms. The internet has given rise to new forms of communication and community, but it has also amplified the spread of hate speech, disinformation, and extremism. Platforms face the difficult task of deciding how to regulate content while respecting free expression. Should they remove posts that promote intolerance? Should they allow harmful ideas to remain visible in the hope that they can be countered by better arguments? These questions mirror the larger debate about how to address intolerance in society as a whole. The paradox of tolerance is not an easy problem to solve, and it doesn't offer a one-size-fits-all answer. Instead, it invites us to reflect on what kind of society we want to build and what we are willing to do to protect it. Tolerance is a powerful and essential value, but it cannot survive without thoughtful boundaries. By understanding the limits of tolerance, we can create a world where diversity, freedom, and mutual respect can truly thrive. In doing so, we honor not only the principle of tolerance, but also the humanity that it seeks to preserve. The paradox of hedonism is the idea that the more directly you chase pleasure, the harder it becomes to achieve it. On the surface, this might seem counterintuitive. After all, isn't pursuing happiness and enjoyment the point of life for many people? But when you start to examine this paradox more deeply, it begins to make sense. Pleasure is not something you can grab and hold onto. It is often a byproduct of other activities, other goals, and other states of mind. The harder you focus on pleasure itself, the more elusive it tends to become. Imagine someone whose sole purpose in life is to experience joy. They wake up each day and ask themselves what will make them feel good. Perhaps they spend hours consuming entertainment or indulging in their favorite foods. For a time, this might seem fulfilling, but eventually the joy begins to fade. The same activities that once felt exciting or satisfying start to lose their charm. This is because pleasure, when treated as the ultimate goal, often leads to diminishing returns. The more you focus on maximizing enjoyment, the less you find it. The paradox of hedonism highlights how pleasure is a fleeting experience. It can't be sustained indefinitely, and it loses its power when pursued too obsessively. For example, think about eating a dessert you love. The first bite is incredible. It's sweet, rich, and satisfying. By the third or fourth bite, the experience is less intense. If you continue to eat, you might even stop enjoying it altogether. What once brought pleasure now feels ordinary or even unpleasant. This is the essence of the paradox. By fixating on the pleasure itself, you can lose the ability to enjoy it. Now consider a different scenario. Imagine someone who doesn't focus on chasing pleasure, but instead works toward meaningful goals. Perhaps they enjoy painting or volunteering in their community. These activities may not always feel immediately pleasurable. Sometimes they might be challenging or require effort. But over time, these pursuits bring a deeper, more lasting sense of satisfaction. The pleasure they experience is not the result of seeking pleasure directly, but comes as a natural byproduct of doing something meaningful. This is the key insight of the paradox of hedonism. Pleasure is best achieved indirectly. Philosophers and psychologists have long studied this phenomenon. John Stuart Mill, a 19th century philosopher, observed that happiness is not something to be pursued directly. Instead, it is something that arises when people focus on other things, relationships, personal growth, or contributing to society. Mill believed that happiness was like a shadow. It follows you when you're focused on other pursuits, but it disappears when you turn to chase it. This idea is supported by modern psychology as well. Research on happiness shows that people who chase pleasure for its own sake often feel less satisfied over time. For example, someone who constantly seeks material wealth might initially feel happy when they acquire something new. But this happiness fades quickly, and they feel the need to seek out the next purchase to recapture the feeling. This cycle can become exhausting and unfulfilling. In contrast, people who focus on building strong relationships or finding purpose in their work often report higher levels of happiness, even if they aren't explicitly chasing it. Another way to understand the paradox of hedonism is to think about flow states. Flow is a mental state where you're completely absorbed in an activity, losing track of time and feeling fully engaged. This state often brings a deep sense of satisfaction, but it doesn't happen when you're focused on the idea of being happy. Instead, flow occurs when you're focused on the activity itself, whether it's writing, playing music, or solving a challenging problem. The pleasure comes naturally as a result of being fully present in the moment. This insight has practical implications for how we live our lives. If chasing pleasure directly often leads to frustration or dissatisfaction, what should we do instead? The answer lies in shifting our focus. Instead of asking, "What will make me happy right now?" we might ask, "What will give my life meaning?" Or, "What activities do I find engaging and fulfilling?" By pursuing goals and interests that matter to us, we're more likely to experience lasting happiness as a byproduct. For example, consider someone who loves gardening. They might spend hours planting, weeding, and tending to their plants. Gardening is hard work, and it might not always feel pleasurable in the moment, especially when it's hot outside or when pests ruin their crops. But over time, the gardener experiences a deep sense of satisfaction from seeing their efforts pay off. The beauty of the garden and the joy of nurturing life bring pleasure, even though those weren't the gardener's primary goals. This principle applies to relationships as well. If someone focuses entirely on how much pleasure or happiness their relationships bring them, they might become frustrated when things aren't perfect. But if they focus on being a good friend, partner, or parent, on showing kindness and support, the relationship itself becomes a source of joy. The happiness comes from the effort and care they invest, not from chasing a feeling of happiness. The paradox of hedonism also sheds light on why overindulgence often leads to dissatisfaction. When we focus too much on maximizing pleasure, we can become desensitized to it. For example, someone who constantly seeks excitement or novelty might find that what once thrilled them no longer has the same effect. This is because the human brain adapts to repeated stimuli. Over time, even the most enjoyable experiences can lose their impact if they're overdone. In contrast, moderation allows us to savor and appreciate pleasures more deeply. This doesn't mean we should avoid pleasure altogether. Pleasure is an important part of life, and it can enrich our experiences in meaningful ways. The key is to approach it with balance and perspective. When we treat pleasure as a byproduct of meaningful activities rather than the ultimate goal, it becomes more sustainable and rewarding. The paradox of hedonism reminds us that life is not about constant highs or fleeting moments of joy. True happiness comes from engaging with the world in meaningful ways, building connections, pursuing goals, and finding fulfillment in the journey itself. Pleasure is not something we can force or demand. It is something we allow to happen when we focus on what truly matters. By embracing this perspective, we can break free from the cycle of chasing short-term pleasure and instead cultivate a deeper, more lasting sense of well-being. The paradox of hedonism is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be understood. When we stop chasing pleasure and start living with purpose, we find that happiness often follows us, quietly and effortlessly, like a shadow. The paradox of voting, also called the Downs paradox, explores a puzzling contradiction in human behavior. On the surface, voting seems like a simple civic duty, something millions of people participate in during elections. But when analyzed through the lens of logic and mathematics, a question emerges. Why do people vote at all? In most elections, the likelihood that a single vote will decide the outcome is incredibly small. Given the time and effort it takes to cast a vote, the personal cost often outweighs the probability of making a meaningful impact. Yet, millions of people continue to participate in elections across the world. This behavior raises fascinating questions about human motivation, rationality, and the nature of democracy itself. At the heart of the paradox is the idea that, for a rational individual, voting doesn't seem to make sense. Economists and political scientists use a basic framework to explain this. They argue that the decision to vote involves weighing the costs and benefits. The cost of voting might include time spent traveling to a polling place, waiting in line, or learning about the candidates and issues. On the other side is the benefit, which is the chance of influencing the outcome multiplied by the perceived value of your preferred candidate winning. The problem arises because the probability of casting the decisive vote is almost zero in most elections. In a national election with millions of voters, the chance that your vote will determine the outcome is so small that it's effectively negligible. This calculation suggests that the expected benefit of voting is lower than the cost, meaning a rational person should choose not to vote. However, people do vote, often in large numbers. This gap between theory and reality is what makes the paradox so intriguing. If rational self-interest isn't enough to explain voter behavior, what else motivates people? One possibility is the idea of civic duty. Many people believe that voting is a responsibility, a way to contribute to society. Even if their vote doesn't sway the outcome, participating in the democratic process feels important. This sense of duty can outweigh the costs and encourage people to vote. Civic duty isn't about calculating probabilities or outcomes. It's about doing what feels morally or socially right. It's a powerful motivator that goes beyond the individual and taps into a collective sense of responsibility. Another explanation for the paradox involves social pressures. In many communities, voting is seen as a sign of good citizenship. People may vote to maintain their reputation or to avoid being criticized by friends and family. Social norms can play a big role in shaping behavior, even when the individual benefits are unclear. For example, campaigns that emphasize high voter turnout rates often rely on this principle. If people believe that everyone else is voting, they may feel obligated to do the same. The fear of being judged for not participating can be a strong motivator, even if the act itself seems irrational from a purely individual standpoint. There's also the psychological satisfaction that comes from voting. Some people enjoy the process of making their voice heard, even if it's symbolic. Casting a vote can feel empowering, giving people a sense of agency in shaping the future. This emotional reward may not have a tangible impact on the election, but it can be deeply meaningful to the voter. It's similar to other forms of symbolic participation, like attending a protest or signing a petition. The act itself becomes the reward, independent of the outcome. For others, voting is tied to identity. People who strongly identify with a political party or movement may feel compelled to vote as an expression of that identity. It's not just about influencing the outcome, it's about reinforcing their sense of belonging. By voting, they affirm their commitment to the group and its values. This connection between identity and behavior helps explain why some people are highly motivated to vote, even in elections where the stakes seem low. The paradox of voting also raises questions about how democracies function. If most people decided not to vote because of the low probability of making a difference, elections would lose their legitimacy. The health of a democracy depends on widespread participation. While an individual vote might not change the outcome, the collective act of voting ensures that the process remains fair and representative. This creates a kind of collective paradox. Voting is individually irrational, but collectively essential. Democracies rely on the fact that people behave in ways that go beyond narrow self-interest. Without this willingness to participate, the system would collapse. Interestingly, the paradox becomes even more complex when you consider smaller elections. In local or regional contests, the number of voters is much smaller, which increases the likelihood that a single vote could matter. Yet, voter turnout tends to be lower in these elections compared to national ones. This suggests that factors like civic duty, social pressure, and identity may play a larger role in driving voter behavior than the actual probability of making a difference. People seem more motivated to vote when the election feels important, even if their individual impact remains minimal. Some theorists argue that the paradox of voting highlights the limits of rational choice theory. Human behavior is not always driven by cold calculations of cost and benefit. Emotions, values, and social norms often play a larger role than logic alone. This doesn't mean that voting is irrational. It simply suggests that the motivations behind it are more complex than they might appear at first glance. By looking beyond the numbers, we can gain a deeper understanding of why people vote and what it means to participate in a democracy. Despite its contradictions, the paradox of voting underscores the importance of individual actions in shaping collective outcomes. Every vote, while seemingly insignificant on its own, contributes to the larger process of decision-making. It's a reminder that democracy is not about any single individual, it's about the power of the collective. People vote not because they expect to change the outcome, but because they believe in the value of participation itself. This belief is what sustains democratic systems, even in the face of seemingly irrational behavior. The paradox also invites us to think critically about how we can encourage voter participation. If the goal is to increase turnout, focusing on the probability of making a difference may not be the best approach. Instead, emphasizing the intrinsic value of voting, the sense of agency, civic responsibility, and connection it provides, may be more effective. Campaigns that tap into these deeper motivations are more likely to resonate with people and inspire them to take action. Ultimately, the paradox of voting challenges us to consider what it means to be part of a society. It reminds us that our actions don't exist in isolation. They are part of a larger web of relationships, responsibilities, and shared values. While an individual vote may not determine the outcome of an election, it contributes to the legitimacy of the process. By participating, we affirm our commitment to the principles of democracy and the idea that every voice matters, even when the math suggests otherwise. This perspective helps resolve the paradox, showing that voting is not just an act of self-interest. It's a statement of belief in something greater than ourselves. The equality paradox is a concept that explores the challenges and contradictions that arise when we aim to create equality in society. On the surface, the idea of equality seems simple. Everyone should have the same opportunities, rights, and access to resources. But when we try to implement equality in practice, we often encounter unexpected results. Efforts to create fairness can sometimes lead to new forms of inequality, creating a paradox that challenges our understanding of what equality truly means. To understand this paradox, it's helpful to think about equality in two ways: equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Equality of opportunity means everyone starts with the same chances in life. For example, a society might provide free education to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, has the same chance to succeed. Equality of outcome, on the other hand, focuses on ensuring that everyone achieves similar results. This might involve redistributing wealth or resources to reduce gaps between the rich and the poor. The paradox arises because pursuing one type of equality often conflicts with the other. Let's take education as an example. Providing equal opportunities might mean giving every child access to the same schools, teachers, and resources. But even if everyone starts with the same opportunities, not everyone will achieve the same outcomes. Some students might excel because they have supportive families, while others might struggle due to challenges outside of school, like poverty or illness. If society then steps in to equalize outcomes by giving extra support to struggling students or redistributing resources, it could lead to perceptions of unfairness among those who are already succeeding. The effort to level the playing field might unintentionally create resentment or even new inequalities. Another example can be seen in the workplace. Imagine a company trying to achieve gender equality by ensuring that men and women are represented equally in leadership roles. This might involve implementing policies like quotas, where a certain number of positions are reserved for women. While the intention is to address historical imbalances, these policies can sometimes lead to the perception that individuals are being chosen based on their gender rather than their qualifications. This perception can undermine trust and create tension among employees. In trying to correct one form of inequality, the company might unintentionally introduce another. The equality paradox also appears in economic systems. In capitalist societies, people are often rewarded based on their effort, skills, or talents. This system creates incentives for innovation and hard work, but it also leads to significant inequalities in wealth and income. To address these disparities, governments might implement policies like progressive taxation or social welfare programs. While these measures aim to create a more equal society, they can also create tensions between different social groups. For instance, wealthier individuals might feel that they are being unfairly penalized for their success, while others might feel that the support they receive isn't enough to truly level the playing field. The result is a cycle where efforts to promote equality can deepen divisions rather than resolve them. One way to explore the equality paradox is through the concept of fairness. People have different ideas about what fairness means, and these differences often shape how they view equality. Some believe fairness means treating everyone the same, regardless of their circumstances. Others believe fairness means recognizing differences and providing extra help to those who need it. These perspectives can clash, especially when decisions are made about distributing resources or opportunities. For example, in healthcare, should everyone receive the same level of care, or should more resources go to those who are most vulnerable? Either approach can lead to criticisms of unfairness, depending on one's perspective. History provides many examples of the equality paradox in action. The civil rights movement in the United States sought to address deep racial inequalities by demanding equal rights and opportunities for all. While significant progress was made, the journey toward equality also highlighted the complexities of achieving it. For instance, affirmative action programs were introduced to address systemic disadvantages faced by marginalized groups. These programs aimed to level the playing field, but they also sparked debates about whether they created new forms of discrimination. Supporters argued that such measures were necessary to address historical injustices, while critics claimed they undermined the principle of meritocracy. This tension illustrates how efforts to achieve equality can provoke resistance and highlight competing ideas about fairness. Another historical example is the rise of socialism in the 20th century. Socialist movements aimed to eliminate economic inequality by redistributing wealth and resources. While these efforts succeeded in reducing income gaps in some cases, they also faced significant challenges. In many socialist states, attempts to equalize outcomes led to inefficiencies, corruption, and restrictions on individual freedoms. People who worked harder or contributed more felt demotivated when their efforts weren't rewarded, while others exploited the system. These issues demonstrate how striving for equality can sometimes undermine the very goals it seeks to achieve. The equality paradox isn't just a societal issue. It also plays out in personal relationships. Consider a group of friends splitting a restaurant bill. Some might argue that dividing the bill equally is the fairest approach, regardless of who ordered what. Others might feel that fairness means paying only for what you consumed. Both perspectives have merit, but they can lead to tension if the group can't agree on what fairness looks like. This small-scale example reflects the broader challenges of navigating equality in any context. Psychology also offers insights into the equality paradox. Studies show that people are highly sensitive to perceived unfairness, whether they feel they're being treated worse or better than others. This sensitivity can make it difficult to implement policies or practices that everyone views as fair. Even when measures are designed with the best intentions, they can trigger feelings of resentment or entitlement, which can undermine their effectiveness. So, what can we do about the equality paradox? One approach is to focus on equity rather than equality. While equality treats everyone the same, equity recognizes that people have different needs and circumstances. By tailoring support to individuals rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach, equity aims to achieve fairer outcomes. For example, in education, equity might mean providing additional resources to schools in disadvantaged areas, rather than giving every school the same funding. This approach acknowledges that different groups face different challenges and seeks to address them in a targeted way. Another strategy is to foster open dialogue about fairness and equality. When people feel heard and included in decision-making processes, they're more likely to support measures that promote equality, even if they don't benefit directly. This requires empathy, transparency, and a willingness to address complex issues without oversimplifying them. Ultimately, the equality paradox reminds us that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. Achieving equality requires constant reflection, adaptation, and compromise. It also requires recognizing that perfection is unattainable. No policy or system will ever eliminate all inequalities or satisfy everyone's definition of fairness. But by approaching these challenges with humility and a commitment to progress, we can create a society that strives to balance opportunity, fairness, and respect for all. The equality paradox doesn't have to be a barrier. It can be a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding in the pursuit of a better world. The non-identity paradox is one of those puzzles that challenges how we think about ethics, decisions, and the long-term consequences of our actions. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about responsibility and morality, especially when it comes to choices that affect people who don't yet exist. At its core, the paradox revolves around the idea that the decisions we make today shape who will exist in the future. This creates a strange situation. How can we harm or benefit someone who wouldn't have existed if not for our actions? Imagine a scenario. A couple is deciding when to have a child. If they choose to conceive now, their child will likely be born with a health condition due to environmental factors or genetic predispositions. But if they wait a few months, they can avoid those risks. Now consider this. The child they conceive later will not be the same individual as the one they would have conceived earlier. In this case, the child born with the health condition cannot say, "I would have been better off if my parents had waited." Why? Because that child would not exist if they had made a different decision. This is the essence of the non-identity paradox. How can we evaluate the morality of decisions that determine whether someone exists at all? This paradox is particularly tricky because it doesn't fit neatly into how we typically think about harm or benefit. Usually, when we talk about harming someone, we assume that person exists and could have been better off. But in the non-identity paradox, the very act of making a different choice means that a completely different person might exist instead. It challenges our usual moral intuitions and makes us think carefully about what it means to harm or help someone. Let's take another example. Imagine a government planning to build a power plant that emits pollution. Suppose the plant will provide energy for decades, but will also release chemicals into the air that could affect the health of future generations. The people who are born after the plant is built will live in a world shaped by that decision. But here's the catch. If the government had chosen not to build the plant, those exact same people wouldn't exist. Different choices lead to different circumstances, which lead to entirely different individuals being born. So can the people affected by the pollution say they were harmed? If the decision to build the plant is what led to their existence, can they claim that it would have been better if the plant hadn't been built, even though they wouldn't exist in that alternative scenario? This line of thinking becomes even more complex when we consider global issues like climate change. Decisions made today about energy use, deforestation, and greenhouse gas emissions will shape the planet for centuries. The people who will live in the distant future will inherit the world shaped by these choices. But the specific individuals who exist in that future will be the result of countless factors influenced by these choices. If the world we create through climate change leads to suffering for future generations, are we harming those people? Or are we simply determining who will exist in the first place? The paradox doesn't stop at hypothetical scenarios. It has real-world implications for how we think about policy, ethics, and responsibility. Consider laws or regulations designed to protect future generations. On one hand, these policies seem to align with a sense of moral duty. We want to leave the world in a better state for those who come after us. But on the other hand, the non-identity paradox complicates this idea. If our actions today determine who will be born, how can we say we're protecting or harming people who owe their existence to those very actions? To untangle this, some philosophers argue that we should focus less on individual identities and more on overall outcomes. Instead of asking whether a particular person is harmed, they suggest we ask whether the world as a whole is better or worse. For example, instead of focusing on whether the child born with a health condition is worse off than the one who could have been born later, we might ask whether the couple's decision leads to a better or worse world overall. This shift in perspective can help sidestep the paradox, but it also raises new questions. What does it mean for the world to be better or worse? Who gets to decide that, and based on what criteria? Another way to approach the paradox is to think about fairness across generations. Even if we can't say that specific future individuals are harmed by our actions, we might still have a responsibility to ensure that future generations, as a whole, inherit a livable world. This idea is often called intergenerational justice. It suggests that we have a moral obligation to avoid making decisions that create unnecessary suffering for future people, even if those people wouldn't exist without those decisions. It's a way of looking beyond the paradox to focus on the broader impact of our choices. At the same time, the non-identity paradox reminds us that our choices are deeply interconnected. Every decision we make ripples through time, influencing countless outcomes. This can feel overwhelming, but it also highlights the importance of intentionality. When we make decisions, we shape not only our own lives, but also the lives of countless others who come after us. The paradox forces us to confront the weight of that responsibility. It also encourages humility. The non-identity paradox shows us the limits of our moral frameworks. It reveals that some questions don't have easy answers, and that our usual ways of thinking about harm, benefit, and responsibility may not always apply. This can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating. Recognizing the complexity of these issues allows us to approach them with greater thoughtfulness and care. Ultimately, the non-identity paradox is not about solving a puzzle or finding a definitive answer. It's about grappling with the difficult questions that arise when we think about the long-term consequences of our actions. It challenges us to move beyond simple notions of right and wrong and to consider the broader, interconnected web of choices and outcomes that shape our world. By doing so, it helps us think more deeply about what it means to act ethically, not just for ourselves, but for future generations as well. The prediction paradox is one of those fascinating ideas that forces you to rethink how we understand cause and effect. It's the kind of concept that seems simple at first, but becomes increasingly tangled the more you try to pull it apart. At its heart, the paradox asks a single question: can we truly predict the future? And if we can, does that act of prediction itself alter what happens? The very idea of knowing the future suggests that we might also have the ability to change it. But if we change it, does that mean the prediction was never valid in the first place? To understand this paradox, imagine a simple scenario. A fortune teller predicts that you will take a specific route home tomorrow, and while on that route, you will run into an old friend you haven't seen in years. The prediction seems plausible enough, so you decide to follow that route, either out of curiosity or just to test if the prediction will come true. On the way, just as the fortune teller said, you meet your friend. At first glance, it seems like the prediction was accurate. But was it? What if you had never heard the prediction? Would you still have chosen that route and met your friend? Or was the act of hearing the prediction the very thing that influenced your actions and made it come true? Now take this a step further. What if you actively decided to defy the prediction? Maybe you deliberately choose a different route home, determined to prove the fortune teller wrong. By doing so, you might think you've broken the prediction. But what if, by sheer coincidence, your friend happens to be on this new route instead? In this case, the prediction technically comes true, but not in the way you expected. This raises an unsettling question. Is the future fixed, or are we shaping it in real time, even as we attempt to predict it? The prediction paradox becomes even more complex when we involve systems larger than a single individual. Think about weather forecasting. Meteorologists predict a storm, and that prediction leads people to prepare. They stock up on supplies, reinforce their homes, and in some cases, even evacuate. As a result, the damage caused by the storm is far less severe than it might have been if no prediction had been made. But this creates a curious situation. Was the prediction accurate because it anticipated what would happen naturally, or did it create a new reality by changing people's behavior? If no one had acted on the forecast, would the storm have caused more damage? Does the act of making a prediction inevitably influence the outcome? This feedback loop is central to the prediction paradox. A prediction, by its very nature, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Once it is made, it becomes part of the reality it seeks to describe. People react to predictions. They prepare, they change their plans, they adapt. In doing so, they may confirm the prediction, invalidate it, or even create entirely new outcomes. This dynamic makes it almost impossible to untangle cause and effect. Did the prediction shape the future, or was it simply describing an inevitable outcome? Let's explore this idea through another example, this time involving technology. Algorithms are increasingly used to predict human behavior, from what we'll buy next to which route we'll take to work. These predictions, however, aren't passive observations. When an algorithm predicts what you might like to watch on a streaming platform, for example, it doesn't simply reflect your preferences, it actively shapes them. By showing you a curated list of suggestions, it influences what you choose to watch, which in turn reinforces the algorithm's predictions. Over time, the line between what you want and what the algorithm expects you to want becomes blurred. Are your choices truly your own, or are they a reflection of predictions made about you? This kind of predictive feedback loop isn't limited to entertainment. It plays a role in areas like finance, where market predictions can influence trading behavior, or even in criminal justice, where predictive policing algorithms are used to anticipate where crimes might occur. In both cases, the act of prediction changes the behavior of those involved, creating outcomes that might not have existed otherwise. This isn't inherently good or bad, it's simply the nature of predictions. But it does highlight the paradoxical relationship between knowing the future and influencing it. The prediction paradox also raises profound questions about free will. If someone tells you what will happen tomorrow, do you have the ability to change it? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course you can. After all, the future hasn't happened yet, so you can still make different choices. But the paradox complicates this. If you do change the outcome, was the prediction ever valid to begin with? Or was it simply describing a potential future, one of many possibilities? And if the prediction was always going to influence your actions, did you ever truly have free will in the first place? Philosophers and scientists have long debated whether the future is fixed or fluid. Some argue that the universe operates according to deterministic principles, meaning that every event is the result of a chain of prior causes. In this view, the future is already written, even if we can't yet see it. Predictions, then, aren't creating new realities, they're simply revealing what is already destined to happen. Others take the opposite view, suggesting that the future is shaped by the choices we make in the present. From this perspective, predictions are inherently unreliable because they can never account for the infinite variables that influence human behavior. One fascinating variation of the prediction paradox is known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. This occurs when a prediction directly causes the outcome it describes. For example, if a teacher tells a student they are destined to succeed, the student might work harder, believing in their own potential, and ultimately achieve success. On the other hand, a negative prediction can have the opposite effect. If a student is told they will fail, they might internalize that belief, lose motivation, and struggle as a result. In both cases, the prediction doesn't just describe the future, it actively creates it. The reverse can also happen. A prediction can fail precisely because people act to prevent it. Imagine an economist predicts a financial collapse. In response, governments and institutions take drastic measures to stabilize the economy, preventing the collapse from occurring. The prediction, while technically incorrect, still serves a purpose by prompting action. This is often referred to as a self-defeating prophecy, where the very act of predicting something prevents it from happening. The prediction paradox becomes especially intriguing when applied to larger philosophical questions. If we could perfectly predict the future, would we want to? What would happen to our sense of agency if we knew every choice we would ever make? Some argue that certainty about the future would strip life of its meaning. Without the unknown, there would be no curiosity, no risk, no growth. Others suggest that knowing the future could empower us, allowing us to make better decisions and avoid unnecessary suffering. But the paradox reminds us that knowing the future and changing it are inseparably linked. The moment we predict the future, we begin to reshape it, and in doing so, we may lose the very clarity we sought to gain. In the end, the prediction paradox challenges us to think about time, causality, and choice in new ways. It reveals that the future isn't a distant, fixed reality waiting to unfold. It's something we're actively creating in the present. Every decision we make, every reaction to a prediction, every attempt to shape what's to come, contributes to the complex, ever-evolving web of cause and effect. The paradox isn't just a puzzle to solve, it's a reflection of the dynamic relationship between knowledge and action. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson of all. The future is not something we passively observe, but something we actively participate in, even as we try to predict it. The twin paradox is one of the most fascinating ideas in physics. At its core, it challenges our understanding of time and how it behaves under different circumstances. While the concept comes from Einstein's theory of relativity, it can be explained without requiring a deep understanding of complex equations. The paradox explores what happens to time when two people, who started in the same place and at the same time, experience different paths through the universe. Imagine two identical twins. Let's call them Alex and Jamie. They are the same age, born at the exact same time, and live their lives together on Earth. One day, Alex decides to board a spaceship and travel far away into space, while Jamie stays on Earth. Alex's spaceship is capable of traveling close to the speed of light, an unimaginable speed by everyday standards, but well within the possibilities of Einstein's relativity. The journey lasts several years, and then Alex returns home. Here's where the paradox begins. When Alex steps out of the spaceship and meets Jamie again, they are no longer the same age. Alex has aged far less than Jamie. This difference is not just a perception or illusion. It is real, measurable, and an unavoidable consequence of how time works when objects move at incredibly high speeds. To Jamie, who stayed on Earth, time moved at its usual steady pace. For Alex, traveling at nearly the speed of light, time passed more slowly. This outcome might seem hard to believe. After all, time feels like it should pass at the same rate for everyone. But Einstein's theory of relativity shows us that time is not fixed. It is not a universal constant that ticks away identically for everyone, everywhere. Instead, time is relative. How you experience it depends on how fast you are moving and the strength of the gravitational field around you. To understand the twin paradox, it helps to think about time dilation. Time dilation is a concept from relativity that describes how time slows down for an object in motion relative to an observer who is stationary. The faster you move, the more time slows down for you compared to someone who is not moving. This effect only becomes noticeable at extremely high speeds, close to the speed of light. At everyday speeds, the difference is so small that it is impossible to detect. Let's return to Alex and Jamie. For Jamie, who stayed on Earth, life went on as usual. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. But for Alex, who was traveling close to the speed of light, time passed differently. While the journey might have felt like only a few years to Alex, far more time passed for Jamie back on Earth. This difference happens because, in Alex's frame of reference, the faster speed slowed time down. Alex's biological processes, heartbeats, aging, and everything else, occurred more slowly than Jamie's. The paradox becomes even more interesting when you think about it from Alex's perspective. From Alex's point of view, Jamie was the one moving away at great speed, while Alex remained in the spaceship. Shouldn't time have slowed down for Jamie instead of Alex? At first glance, this seems like a contradiction, but the resolution lies in the fact that Alex's journey involved acceleration and deceleration, while Jamie's did not. Relativity treats acceleration differently than steady motion. Alex's change in speed when leaving and returning to Earth introduces an asymmetry in their experiences of time. This difference breaks the symmetry and makes Alex the one who experiences less time overall. The twin paradox has been tested in real-life experiments, though not with humans traveling close to the speed of light. Scientists have used highly accurate atomic clocks to observe time dilation. In one famous experiment, a clock was placed on an airplane traveling at high speeds, while another identical clock remained stationary on the ground. After the plane completed its journey, the two clocks were compared. The clock on the plane showed slightly less time had passed compared to the clock on the ground. The difference was tiny because the plane's speed was much slower than the speed of light, but it was enough to confirm the predictions of relativity. The implications of the twin paradox go far beyond the realm of thought experiments or simple curiosity. It demonstrates that time is not absolute. It also has practical applications in modern technology. For example, the satellites that power GPS systems orbit Earth at high speeds and experience weaker gravitational fields than we do on the surface. Both of these factors, speed and gravity, affect how time passes for the satellites. Engineers must account for these differences to ensure GPS calculations remain accurate. Without adjusting for relativity, the system would quickly become unreliable. The twin paradox also sparks profound questions about the nature of time itself. If time is not universal, what does that mean for how we understand our lives, our relationships, and our place in the universe? The paradox shows that our everyday experience of time is just one version of reality. Other perspectives, moving at different speeds or experiencing different gravitational conditions, could see time in ways that are completely alien to us. It also invites us to think about the possibility of interstellar travel. If humanity were ever able to build spacecraft capable of approaching the speed of light, the twin paradox would become a reality for the travelers. Imagine an astronaut embarking on a journey to a distant star system and returning to Earth after what felt like only a few years. For the people left behind on Earth, decades or even centuries might have passed. The astronaut would return to a world that had moved far beyond the one they left. Friends and family would have aged or passed away, and the society they knew might look completely different. This idea might seem unsettling, but it is also a reminder of how interconnected space, time, and motion are. The twin paradox is not just a theoretical curiosity. It is a glimpse into how the universe really works, even if those workings challenge our intuition. It forces us to see time not as a straight line, but as something flexible, something that can stretch, shrink, or even stop under the right conditions. The paradox also underscores the importance of perspective. In many ways, the twin paradox is a story about two perspectives, Alex's and Jamie's, and how the same journey can be experienced so differently depending on where you stand. This relativity of perspective is not just a physical phenomenon, it is also a metaphor for how we understand the world around us. Just as Alex and Jamie experience time differently, people in our everyday lives often see events and experiences in ways that differ from our own. Understanding and accepting those differences can lead to deeper connections and insights. Ultimately, the twin paradox reminds us that the universe is far more complex and fascinating than it seems on the surface. It shows us that time is not a rigid framework, but a dynamic aspect of reality, one that changes based on speed, gravity, and motion. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions and embrace the wonder of a universe where time itself is relative. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that even the simplest concepts, like two twins and the passage of time, can reveal profound truths about the nature of existence. The whole argument is a philosophical problem that arises in the study of physics, particularly in the context of general relativity. At its heart, the argument challenges how we think about the relationship between mathematics, physical reality, and the way we describe the universe. It raises questions about whether the structures we use to explain space, time, and matter are truly grounded in reality, or whether they are simply tools we use to organize our understanding. To grasp the whole argument, it helps to start with the basics of general relativity. In Einstein's theory, space-time is described as a four-dimensional fabric that combines the three dimensions of space with time. This space-time can bend and curve in response to the presence of mass and energy, which is what causes gravity. The equations of general relativity, known as Einstein's field equations, describe how this relationship works. These equations link the geometry of space-time to the distribution of matter and energy. Now imagine that we use these equations to model a region of space-time. This region might include stars, planets, or just empty space. The mathematical model we create assigns certain properties, like curvature or coordinates, to every point in that region. These properties describe the shape of space-time and how objects within it behave. In doing this, we assume that the mathematical structure we use corresponds directly to physical reality. The whole argument challenges this assumption. To understand how, consider a hole in space-time. This hole is a region where no matter or energy exists, meaning it is entirely empty. The argument asks, if space-time itself is a physical entity, and if our mathematical descriptions are correct, can we uniquely determine the properties of space-time in this empty region based solely on the matter and energy outside of it? The surprising answer, according to the whole argument, is no. The reason lies in the mathematical flexibility of general relativity. In this theory, the equations remain true even if you shift or relabel the points of space-time. Imagine taking the mathematical coordinates of one point in the whole and swapping them with another point's coordinates. This relabeling doesn't change the geometry of spacetime or the solutions to Einstein's equations, but it does create a different mathematical description of the same physical reality. This means that there can be multiple, equally valid mathematical models for what's happening inside the whole, even though they predict the same outcomes outside it. This creates a problem. If two different descriptions can explain the same physical situation, then which one is real? Does the geometry of spacetime inside the whole actually exist, or is it just a mathematical convenience? The whole argument suggests that we cannot definitively determine the structure of spacetime in the absence of matter or energy. This leads to the unsettling conclusion that spacetime itself may not be a tangible, physical entity, but rather a framework we use to describe the relationships between objects. To see this issue more clearly, think of a simpler analogy. Imagine you have a map of a city. The map assigns coordinates to every location, like a street or a park. If you shift the entire map by a few centimeters, the physical locations in the city don't change. The park is still where it was, and the streets remain in the same places. What changes is how we label those locations on the map. Similarly, in general relativity, shifting the mathematical labels of spacetime points doesn't alter the physical reality. But unlike a map, which corresponds to fixed landmarks in the real world, spacetime in the whole argument doesn't seem to have those fixed landmarks. In an empty region, there's nothing to anchor the coordinates to reality. This leads to deeper philosophical questions. If spacetime isn't a physical entity, then what is it? Some physicists and philosophers argue that spacetime is a relational concept, meaning it only exists in the context of relationships between objects. In this view, spacetime doesn't have an independent existence. It's simply a way of describing how objects interact with one another. For example, if two stars are a certain distance apart, spacetime provides the language to describe that distance. Without objects to measure or describe, spacetime becomes meaningless. Others argue that spacetime is real, but our mathematical tools are limited. They suggest that the whole argument doesn't show spacetime is unreal, but rather that our methods of describing it are incomplete. In this interpretation, the fact that we can create multiple mathematical models for the same physical situation doesn't undermine the reality of spacetime. Instead, it highlights the complexity of the universe and the limitations of human understanding. The whole argument also has implications for determinism, the idea that the future is fully determined by the present. In classical physics, if you know the current state of a system, you can predict its future behavior with complete accuracy. But in general relativity, the whole argument shows that the properties of spacetime in a given region can't always be uniquely determined by the matter and energy around it. This raises questions about whether the universe is truly deterministic, or whether there's an element of unpredictability built into its very structure. Einstein himself struggled with these ideas. While he initially embraced the relational view of spacetime, he later reconsidered and explored other interpretations. The debate over the nature of spacetime continues to this day, with physicists and philosophers offering a range of perspectives. Some propose that quantum mechanics, which governs the behavior of particles on very small scales, might hold the key to resolving the questions raised by the whole argument. Others believe that new mathematical frameworks or entirely different theories of gravity might provide answers. Despite its abstract nature, the whole argument has practical implications. Understanding the nature of spacetime is crucial for developing a unified theory of physics, one that combines general relativity with quantum mechanics. These two pillars of modern physics describe the universe at vastly different scales, but they don't currently fit together in a coherent way. The whole argument highlights one of the challenges in bridging this gap: the need to rethink how we conceptualize spacetime and its role in the universe. In everyday life, the whole argument may seem far removed from our experiences. After all, we don't encounter empty regions of spacetime or need to consider the flexibility of mathematical coordinates. But the ideas it raises touch on fundamental questions about the nature of reality. What does it mean for something to exist? How do we distinguish between the physical world and the tools we use to describe it? These questions may not have easy answers, but they remind us of the depth and mystery of the universe. The whole argument is a testament to the power of ideas. It shows that even a simple question about empty space can lead to profound insights into the nature of existence. Whether space-time is a physical entity, a relational concept, or something entirely beyond our comprehension, the debate it inspires pushes the boundaries of human understanding. In the process, it reminds us that the universe is far more intricate and enigmatic than we often realize. The Münchhausen Trilemma is a philosophical concept that raises a deep and fundamental question about knowledge and justification. It challenges the way we try to prove what we know, and in doing so, it reveals the limits of human reasoning. Named after the fictional character Baron Münchhausen, who supposedly pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, the trilemma illustrates that any attempt to justify a claim ultimately leads to one of three unsatisfying conclusions. Each of these conclusions highlights a problem in how we think about proving things. Imagine you make a claim like the Earth revolves around the sun. Someone might ask, how do you know that? You could point to evidence, such as scientific observations or the laws of physics. But then they might ask, how do you know those laws of physics are true? At some point, this chain of questioning leads to a need for justification. The Münchhausen Trilemma asks us to think about what happens when we try to justify any belief, whether it's about science, morality, or even everyday experiences. When you look closely, you find that all attempts at justification end in one of three ways: circular reasoning, infinite regression, or axiomatic assumptions. Circular reasoning is the first horn of the trilemma. It happens when the proof for a claim ends up relying on the claim itself. For example, imagine someone says, I know the Earth revolves around the sun because science tells me so. If asked why they trust science, they might respond, because science is based on reliable observations and experiments. But when you dig deeper and ask why those observations and experiments are trustworthy, they may ultimately return to, because science says so. In this case, the reasoning loops back on itself. Circular reasoning can feel convincing because it provides a tidy answer, but it doesn't actually justify the original claim. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It may look like you're accomplishing something, but you're not actually making progress. The second option is infinite regression. This occurs when every justification requires another justification, leading to an endless chain. If you were to ask why the Earth revolves around the sun and someone explained it using the laws of gravity, you might then ask why the laws of gravity work. They could point to mathematical models, but then you could question the validity of those models, and so on. In this case, each answer depends on another deeper answer, with no ultimate foundation. Infinite regression can feel unsatisfying because it never provides a final stopping point. Instead, it leaves you with an endless series of explanations, none of which offers a solid conclusion. The third option is axiomatic assumptions, where you stop the chain of justification by declaring something to be self-evident or beyond question. For example, you might say, I trust the laws of physics because they're simply true. This approach ends the questioning but does so arbitrarily. By deciding that certain things don't require justification, you avoid the problems of circular reasoning and infinite regression, but you're left with an assumption that isn't itself proven. Axiomatic assumptions are common in many areas of thought, including mathematics, science, and philosophy. For instance, in geometry, Euclid's axioms are accepted as starting points without proof. However, this approach raises the question of why we should accept some assumptions and not others. The Münchhausen Trilemma doesn't just apply to abstract philosophical debates. It has real implications for how we think and argue in everyday life. Consider debates about ethics. If someone says it's wrong to harm others, you might ask why they believe that. They could point to societal norms, but you could then ask why those norms are valid. If they argue that morality is based on human empathy, you could ask why empathy should be the foundation of morality. At some point, they'll either circle back to their original claim, rely on an endless chain of justifications, or declare something as self-evident. The trilemma shows that no matter how much effort we put into justifying our beliefs, we eventually hit a wall. This realization can feel unsettling. It challenges the idea that we can ever fully justify what we know. However, the trilemma isn't meant to undermine all knowledge or suggest that nothing is true. Instead, it encourages us to be more thoughtful about how we justify our beliefs and to recognize the limitations of our reasoning. Rather than seeing the trilemma as a dead end, we can view it as a reminder to approach knowledge with humility. It shows us that while we strive for certainty, some level of uncertainty is inevitable. Philosophers have grappled with the implications of the Münchhausen Trilemma for centuries. Some argue that it reveals the need for foundationalism, the idea that certain basic beliefs or assumptions must be accepted without proof. Foundationalists see these basic beliefs as the bedrock on which all other knowledge is built. Others, like proponents of coherentism, suggest that knowledge is justified when our beliefs form a consistent and interconnected web. In this view, the strength of our beliefs comes not from an unshakable foundation, but from their mutual support. Another response to the trilemma is pragmatism, which focuses on what works rather than what can be fully justified. Pragmatists argue that we should accept beliefs that are useful and effective, even if they can't be proven beyond doubt. For example, we rely on the laws of physics, not because we can justify them absolutely, but because they consistently produce accurate predictions and practical results. In this sense, the trilemma doesn't prevent us from knowing things. It simply reminds us that our knowledge is always provisional. The Münchhausen Trilemma also has implications for scientific inquiry. Science often relies on assumptions that cannot themselves be proven, such as the uniformity of nature or the reliability of our senses. While these assumptions are not immune to the trilemma, they provide a practical foundation for exploration and discovery. Science acknowledges that its conclusions are always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. This openness to change reflects a pragmatic response to the trilemma, recognizing that knowledge is a work in progress rather than a finished product. In everyday life, the trilemma can help us become more aware of the strengths and weaknesses of our arguments. It reminds us to question our assumptions and consider alternative perspectives. At the same time, it encourages us to accept that some level of uncertainty is unavoidable. By recognizing the limits of justification, we can approach disagreements with greater openness and less rigidity. Ultimately, the Münchhausen Trilemma highlights the complexity of human thought. It shows that while we may never achieve absolute certainty, our efforts to justify and understand the world are valuable nonetheless. Each attempt to answer the question, "How do you know?" brings us closer to deeper insights, even if it doesn't lead to a final answer. The trilemma isn't a problem to be solved, but a reminder of the richness and depth of the human pursuit of knowledge. Future Tuesday indifference is a concept that challenges how we perceive time and decisions. Imagine being asked to do something unpleasant, cleaning a messy garage, preparing your taxes, or delivering bad news. If it's scheduled for next Tuesday, you may feel indifferent about it now. The task feels distant and abstract, far enough in the future that it doesn't demand immediate attention or emotional investment. Yet, when that Tuesday finally arrives, the indifference vanishes. The task becomes real, pressing, and unavoidable. This disconnect between how we view future obligations versus their eventual reality reveals something important about human nature and how we perceive time. This phenomenon highlights how our brains prioritize the present over the future. In psychological terms, it's called temporal discounting. We tend to value immediate experiences and emotions more than those in the distant future. When the task is far off, it feels less real. The discomfort or stress it might cause doesn't resonate as strongly. We may even agree to unpleasant tasks for future dates because they feel abstract. It's why we say yes to meetings, commitments, or responsibilities next month that we'd never agree to if they were happening tomorrow. To understand this better, think of how you approach a deadline. If a project is due 6 months from now, you probably feel little urgency to start it today. As the deadline approaches, though, the weight of the task grows heavier. That indifference you felt 6 months ago no longer exists. The task now dominates your thoughts, and procrastination or avoidance becomes a source of stress. This shift illustrates how we trick ourselves into underestimating the impact of future events. Future Tuesday indifference also explains why people struggle with long-term goals. Imagine deciding to eat healthier or save money. When the choice is hypothetical, the trade-offs feel manageable. Skipping dessert every night or putting aside a percentage of your paycheck seems easy when it's just an idea. But when you're faced with the immediate temptation of a chocolate cake or a flash sale, the commitment becomes much harder to honor. The future benefits feel distant, while the present sacrifice feels real. This disconnect doesn't just apply to negative experiences. It also affects how we view positive future events. Consider booking a vacation 6 months in advance. The excitement is real, but it's tempered by how far away the trip feels. As the departure date gets closer, that excitement grows. The vacation transforms from a vague idea to something tangible. The same dynamic happens with smaller, everyday pleasures. Promising yourself a relaxing weekend next month might sound comforting now, but when the time comes, other priorities could overshadow your plans. This pattern is rooted in how our minds process time. The future is always uncertain, and our brains are wired to focus on what's immediate and tangible. For our ancestors, this made sense. Prioritizing short-term survival over long-term planning was often the difference between life and death. If food or shelter was scarce, worrying about something weeks or months away wasn't helpful. While modern life is different, we still carry this mental framework. It's why we often prioritize short-term gains over long-term rewards, even when we know better. Recognizing Future Tuesday indifference can help us make better decisions. If we understand that our indifference toward future tasks or goals is a mental bias, we can counteract it. One way to do this is by imagining how our future selves will feel. If you dread cleaning the garage today, it's unlikely you'll feel any different when the actual Tuesday arrives. Visualizing the task and its emotional impact can make the future feel more real, reducing the tendency to delay or overcommit. Another strategy is to break future tasks into smaller, manageable steps. Instead of promising yourself to tackle the entire garage in one day, start with a single shelf or section. This approach reduces the mental distance between the present and the task, making it easier to overcome procrastination. By focusing on small, immediate actions, you bring the future into the present in a way that feels actionable and less overwhelming. The same principle applies to long-term goals. If you want to save money, for example, start with a small, consistent contribution, rather than aiming for a dramatic lifestyle change. Aiming to save $5 a day feels more achievable than committing to thousands over a year. Similarly, if you're trying to improve your health, focus on one meal or one workout at a time, rather than envisioning an entire lifestyle overhaul. These incremental changes help bridge the gap between the present and the future, making it easier to follow through. Future Tuesday indifference also teaches us about the importance of boundaries. Because the future feels less pressing, we often say yes to commitments we don't truly want to make. Overcommitting leads to stress when those distant tasks pile up and become today's reality. Learning to pause and consider whether you'll truly want to follow through can save you from unnecessary frustration. Asking yourself, would I agree to this if it were tomorrow, can be a powerful filter. This concept also has implications for how we manage stress. Worrying about future events is often counterproductive because it doesn't change the outcome. Yet ignoring them entirely can create larger problems when they inevitably become the present. Striking a balance is key. Acknowledge the future without letting it consume your thoughts. Planning for what's ahead can reduce anxiety, but remember that the only time you can act is now. Future Tuesday indifference isn't inherently negative. In some cases, it protects us from unnecessary stress. Imagine if every future obligation carried the same emotional weight as today's tasks. The mental load would be unbearable. Our tendency to discount the future can help us stay focused on the present. However, this bias becomes a problem when it leads to poor decision-making or unnecessary delays. This idea also reminds us of the importance of mindfulness. When we focus too much on the future, we risk missing the present entirely. By grounding ourselves in the here and now, we can appreciate the moment without getting lost in hypothetical worries. Mindfulness doesn't mean ignoring the future. It means approaching it with clarity and intention, rather than letting it overshadow today. Ultimately, Future Tuesday Indifference reveals how our perception of time shapes our behavior. By understanding this bias, we can make more thoughtful choices, set realistic goals, and reduce unnecessary stress. The future is always uncertain, but we don't have to let that uncertainty dictate our actions. Instead, we can approach it with curiosity and balance, knowing that every day is an opportunity to learn and grow. Whether it's a daunting task or a distant goal, remembering that the future will eventually become the present can help us stay grounded and intentional in our decisions. The consequence paradox is a fascinating concept that challenges how we think about causality and time. It revolves around the idea that certain events or actions can create outcomes that appear to contradict their origin. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we consider how it might apply to time travel, decision-making, or the way our universe operates. At its core, the paradox forces us to question whether the future can influence the past or if an effect can exist without a clear cause. To understand the consequence paradox, let's start with a hypothetical example. Imagine someone travels back in time and gives their younger self a piece of information that dramatically changes their life. Perhaps they tell their past self to invest in a specific company, which leads to incredible wealth. The problem lies in this. Where did the information come from? The older version of this person only knew to invest in the company because they were told to do so as their younger self. The action creates a loop where the cause of the information is the result of the same information being passed backward in time. This raises the question, can something exist if it has no clear point of origin? This idea isn't just limited to science fiction or hypothetical time travel scenarios. It has real implications for how we think about cause and effect. Normally, we assume that every effect must have a preceding cause. For example, if you throw a stone into a pond, the ripples that follow are caused by the motion of the stone hitting the water. This sequence feels intuitive. But what if the ripples existed before the stone hit the water? What if the effect preceded the cause? This is the kind of mental puzzle the consequence paradox creates. A similar idea often appears in thought experiments about time travel. One classic example is the Procrastination Paradox, which overlaps with the consequence paradox in many ways. Imagine a man receives a mysterious book of knowledge one day, filled with brilliant scientific ideas. He uses the book to change the world and becomes famous for his discoveries. Years later, he invents a time machine and decides to send the book back in time, ensuring his younger self receives it. The problem is that the book's contents didn't originate from anyone. They exist in a loop where they are always passed back and forth through time. The knowledge has no clear point of creation, making it an example of the consequence paradox. The paradox challenges the way we understand the universe because it questions the linear nature of time. We often think of time as moving in one direction, from the past to the future. Events unfold sequentially, and causes lead to effects. The consequence paradox suggests that this straightforward flow of time might not be as rigid as it seems. If the future can influence the past, or if an effect can create its own cause, then our understanding of time and causality might need to evolve. Another way to think about the consequence paradox is through the idea of feedback loops. In physics and systems theory, feedback loops occur when the output of a system becomes an input for the same system. Positive feedback amplifies the output, while negative feedback stabilizes it. The consequence paradox introduces a twist. What if the feedback loop doesn't have a starting point? In other words, what if the system's output feeds into its input indefinitely, without any clear beginning? This can be difficult to grasp, because we are so accustomed to thinking in terms of linear progression. Consider the famous example of the bootstrap paradox. Imagine a musician who travels back in time and teaches their younger self how to play a famous song. This younger version grows up, records the song, and releases it, making it a classic hit. Years later, the older version travels back in time again to teach the same song to their younger self. The song exists, but where did it come from? The consequence paradox emerges because the song appears to exist without being created. It loops endlessly through time. The paradox doesn't just challenge how we think about time, it also raises deeper questions about the nature of existence itself. If something can exist without a clear cause, does it change the way we understand reality? For centuries, philosophers have debated whether everything in the universe must have a cause. The consequence paradox suggests that some things might exist in a state of self-causation, where they create themselves. This idea is unsettling because it contradicts one of our most basic assumptions about how the world works. In practical terms, the consequence paradox is often used in discussions about time travel. If we could send information, objects, or people backward in time, it might create situations where causes and effects become intertwined in confusing ways. For example, imagine a scientist invents a cure for a disease and decides to send the cure back in time to prevent the outbreak from ever happening. If the disease is prevented, then the scientist would have no reason to invent the cure in the first place. This creates a paradox where the existence of the cure depends on an event that never occurred. The consequence paradox forces us to confront the limitations of logic when dealing with time travel. Another layer to this paradox involves free will. If the future can influence the past, does it mean that our choices are predetermined? For instance, if someone receives knowledge of their future actions and then makes decisions based on that knowledge, are they truly acting freely? Or are they simply fulfilling a predetermined sequence of events? The consequence paradox complicates our understanding of free will by blurring the line between choice and inevitability. Some scientists and philosophers propose that the consequence paradox might not be a paradox at all. Instead, they suggest that it highlights gaps in our understanding of time and causality. For example, some interpretations of quantum mechanics imply that particles can affect each other instantaneously across vast distances, a phenomenon known as quantum entanglement. This challenges our classical notions of cause and effect, suggesting that the universe might operate according to rules that defy human intuition. In a broader sense, the consequence paradox invites us to question the very structure of reality. If time and causality aren't as fixed as we believe, what does that mean for our understanding of the universe? Could there be other dimensions or frameworks where these paradoxes resolve themselves? While we may not have definitive answers, exploring these questions helps us expand the boundaries of our knowledge. The consequence paradox reminds us that the universe is full of mysteries we are only beginning to understand. It encourages us to think critically about the assumptions we make and to remain open to new ideas, no matter how strange they seem. Whether we encounter this paradox in thought experiments, science fiction, or philosophical discussions, it challenges us to embrace uncertainty and curiosity. Perhaps that's the true value of the consequence paradox. It doesn't just puzzle us, it pushes us to grow. Imagine you're walking through a dense forest, enjoying the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning strikes a nearby swamp. By some extraordinary chain of events, the energy from the lightning combines with the materials in the swamp to create a being. This being, miraculously, is an exact physical copy of you, down to every cell, every thought, every memory. It looks like you, speaks like you, and remembers your entire life. It even thinks it's you. This is the Swampman. The Swampman Paradox was introduced by philosopher Donald Davidson to explore questions of identity, meaning, and consciousness. The paradox forces us to ask, if this being is physically identical to you in every way, does it count as you? Is it the same person? Or is it something entirely different, despite its uncanny resemblance? These questions challenge our understanding of what it means to be a person, to have memories, and to maintain identity over time. One way to approach this thought experiment is to focus on the idea of personal identity. Most people define identity as a combination of physical traits, memories, and personality. If the Swampman has all your memories, your childhood, your friendships, the books you've read, and the experiences you've had, it seems reasonable to think it's you. After all, it remembers the same events that you do and feels the same emotions about them. From the outside, no one, not even the people closest to you, would be able to tell the difference. To them, the Swampman would seem like you in every way. But identity isn't only about appearances or memories. It's also about continuity, your connection to your past self. If you cut yourself yesterday and see the scar today, you recognize it as evidence of something that happened to you. There's a chain of events linking your present self to your past self. The Swampman, however, lacks this continuity. It may have your memories, but it didn't live through the events that created them. The Swampman remembers your high school graduation, but it wasn't there. It remembers your favorite vacation, but it never actually stood on that beach. These are secondhand memories created by random chance rather than lived experience. This raises the question of whether memories alone are enough to make someone you. Philosophers like John Locke argued that memory plays a central role in personal identity. According to Locke, if you remember an event, it was yours. By this reasoning, the Swampman's memories would make it you, even if those memories were created artificially. But others argue that memory isn't enough. They say identity requires a deeper connection to your physical and psychological past, something the Swampman doesn't have. Another way to think about the Swampman is through the concept of meaning. Donald Davidson introduced the paradox partly to explore how meaning is tied to experience. For example, when you use a word, its meaning comes from your interactions with the world. If you say tree, you're referring to all the trees you've seen, touched, and learned about throughout your life. But the Swampman, despite using the same word, hasn't had these experiences. It says tree because its brain is structured like yours, but it hasn't encountered actual trees. Its understanding of the word is disconnected from the world. This lack of connection suggests that the Swampman's thoughts and language might be fundamentally different from yours, even if they seem identical on the surface. Without lived experience, can the Swampman truly mean anything? Or is it simply mimicking the patterns of thought and language built into its structure? These questions challenge our assumptions about the nature of thought and whether it's possible to separate ideas from the experiences that give them meaning. The paradox also touches on the idea of consciousness. If the Swampman has your memories, thoughts, and emotions, does it have consciousness? On one hand, it seems hard to deny. After all, it feels pain, joy, and love just as you do. But on the other hand, its consciousness is disconnected from any history. It wasn't born, didn't grow up, and didn't experience the events it remembers. This leads to a deeper question. Is consciousness something that arises from experience, or can it exist independently? If it's tied to experience, the Swampman might lack true consciousness, despite appearing conscious. If it's independent, then perhaps the Swampman is as conscious as you are. This thought experiment doesn't have easy answers, and that's part of what makes it so powerful. It forces us to confront the assumptions we make about ourselves and others. For example, if we accept that the Swampman isn't you, what does that mean for other situations where identity is disrupted? Think about people who experience memory loss or dramatic personality changes. Are they still the same person? Or consider cases of brain injury, where someone's physical body remains, but their sense of self changes. These real-world scenarios echo the questions raised by the Swampman. The paradox also invites reflection on the nature of humanity. If the Swampman isn't you, does that mean it's less human? Or does its ability to think, feel, and act make it human, regardless of its origins? These questions challenge our understanding of what it means to be human, and whether our humanity depends on our history or simply on our present state of being. Finally, the Swampman Paradox forces us to consider the limits of science and philosophy. While it's easy to get caught up in the mechanics of the thought experiment, how the lightning strike worked, how the swamp materials assembled perfectly into a human form, that's not the point. The paradox isn't about whether such a thing could happen, but about what it reveals about identity, meaning, and consciousness. By stripping away the usual context of birth, growth, and experience, the Swampman exposes the assumptions we make about what it means to be us. In the end, the Swampman Paradox is a reminder of the complexity of identity. It shows us that being you is about more than just memories or physical traits. It's about the connections between your past, present, and future, and the experiences that shape your understanding of the world. Whether or not the Swampman counts as you, It challenges us to think more deeply about what it means to exist and to be. In doing so, it leaves us with more questions than answers, a fitting outcome for a paradox that defies simple explanations. The noisy argument paradox is a concept that reveals something strange about human nature, communication, and how disagreements play out. At its core, it suggests that the louder and more heated an argument becomes, the less likely it is to resolve anything. This paradox isn't just about volume in the literal sense, it's also about the intensity of the emotions, the stakes of the discussion, and the amount of effort both sides put into winning rather than understanding. The harder we push to convince someone we're right, the more they tend to resist. Imagine two people debating a political issue. They start out calmly enough, each presenting their point of view. But as one person starts to push harder to make their case, the other feels cornered. They respond by digging in their heels and countering even more forcefully. Before long, the conversation devolves into interruptions, raised voices, and frustration. Neither person is actually listening anymore. They're just trying to outdo each other. In the end, neither side changes their mind, and both leave the discussion feeling even more convinced they were right all along. This is the noisy argument paradox in action. The paradox stems from a key flaw in how we approach disagreements. When we argue, especially about things we care deeply about, we often assume that the problem lies with the other person. We think, if only they could see things clearly, they would agree with me. But this mindset overlooks the fact that everyone believes their own perspective is valid. No one enters an argument thinking, I'm definitely wrong about this, but I'll argue anyway. When both sides are convinced of their correctness, pushing harder doesn't bridge the gap, it widens it. There's also a psychological element at play. People are naturally defensive when their beliefs are challenged. This is known as the backfire effect. When someone feels attacked, they're more likely to cling to their original position, even in the face of evidence that contradicts it. This happens because beliefs, especially those tied to identity, feel personal. Challenging someone's belief system can feel like challenging who they are. So the louder and more forceful the argument becomes, the more the other person feels the need to defend themselves. In this way, trying harder to win an argument often has the opposite effect. Let's take an everyday example. Picture two friends debating the best way to spend a weekend. One wants to go hiking, while the other prefers relaxing at home. If the friend who loves hiking starts passionately listing all the reasons why it's the superior choice, it's healthy, it's refreshing, it's better for your mental health, the other friend might start to feel attacked, as if their preference for staying home is being painted as lazy or unworthy. Rather than considering the merits of hiking, they might double down on their own preference. Relaxing is just as good for mental health. Hiking is exhausting and stressful. The more the first friend pushes, the more defensive the second becomes, and soon they're not even talking about the weekend anymore. They're arguing about whose lifestyle is better. Neither friend walks away feeling heard or understood, and the paradox wins again. Interestingly, this paradox doesn't only apply to personal arguments. It's also evident in larger societal debates, like politics or cultural issues. Public discourse is often marked by the same pattern, two sides shouting their points at each other, each side convinced the other is simply ignorant or misinformed. The louder and more heated the discussion, the more entrenched everyone becomes. The goal shifts from finding common ground to simply out-arguing the other side. This is why many societal debates feel so polarized. The more noise there is, the harder it becomes to have a meaningful conversation. The noisy argument paradox also reveals something about the role of ego in disagreements. When we argue, it's easy to become focused on winning. We want to prove that we're right, not because it will necessarily improve the situation, but because it feels good to be right. This ego-driven approach makes it harder to listen or empathize with the other person. Instead of focusing on the issue itself, we focus on how the argument makes us feel, whether we feel validated, attacked, or superior. This shift in focus makes resolution almost impossible. One way to escape the noisy argument paradox is to approach disagreements differently. Instead of arguing to win, what if we argued to understand? This doesn't mean we have to agree with the other person. but it does mean taking the time to truly listen to their perspective. When someone feels heard, they're less likely to become defensive. They might even be more open to considering your point of view. This doesn't guarantee agreement, but it does create the possibility for a more meaningful conversation. Let's revisit the friends debating their weekend plans. If the hiker friend said, "I get why you like staying home, it's relaxing, and you've had a busy week," the other friend might feel less defensive. They might even respond with, "Yeah, but I can see how hiking could be fun too. It's been a while since I've been outdoors." By acknowledging the other person's perspective, the conversation shifts from a battle to a discussion. The noise dies down, and resolution becomes more likely. It's also important to recognize when an argument isn't worth having. Not every disagreement needs to be resolved, and not every point of view needs to be debated. Sometimes, the best way to deal with the noisy argument paradox is to avoid the noise altogether. This doesn't mean avoiding all difficult conversations. It means choosing your battles wisely. Ask yourself, is this argument productive? Will it help the relationship, or is it just about proving a point? If the answer is the latter, it might be better to let it go. The paradox reminds us that communication is about more than words. Tone, body language, and intention all play a role. A calm, respectful tone can make a world of difference in how a message is received. Likewise, approaching a disagreement with curiosity rather than judgment can change the entire dynamic. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," try asking, "Why do you think that?" This shifts the focus from confrontation to exploration, making it easier to find common ground. Ultimately, the noisy argument paradox teaches us that shouting louder doesn't make us more persuasive. Winning an argument isn't about overpowering the other person. It's about finding a way to connect, even in disagreement. By listening, empathizing, and letting go of the need to be right, we can break the cycle of noise and create space for real understanding. And sometimes, that understanding starts with the simple act of stepping back and letting the noise fade away. The Pinocchio Paradox is a thought experiment that takes the classic story of Pinocchio and applies it to the realm of logic, self-reference, and truth. In the original tale, Pinocchio is a wooden puppet whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie. This simple rule is the foundation for the paradox. The question arises when Pinocchio says, "My nose will grow now." The logical conflict lies in the fact that if Pinocchio's statement is true, his nose will grow, but his nose only grows when he lies. This creates a loop of contradictions, a self-referential puzzle with no clear resolution. To understand why this paradox is so intriguing, it helps to break it down step by step. First, consider the mechanics of Pinocchio's nose. The rule is clear. His nose grows only when he tells a lie. If Pinocchio says, "My nose will grow now," and his nose does indeed grow, it means his statement was true. However, if the statement is true, then his nose should not have grown because he wasn't lying. This is where the contradiction occurs. On the other hand, if his nose does not grow, it means his statement was false. But if the statement is false, then his nose should grow because he was lying. The statement cannot logically resolve itself, creating an endless cycle. This paradox is an example of what philosophers and logicians call a liar paradox. A classic example of this is the statement, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false, because that's what it claims. But if it's false, then it must be true, because a false claim that says this sentence is false would actually be accurate. The Pinocchio Paradox takes this concept and applies it in a whimsical way, adding a layer of storytelling to an otherwise abstract idea. What makes the Pinocchio Paradox especially interesting is its connection to self-reference. Self-referential statements, statements that refer to themselves, are often where logic breaks down. In Pinocchio's case, his statement about his nose is directly tied to the rule governing his nose's behavior. This creates a feedback loop, much like the liar paradox, where the statement cannot be true or false without contradicting itself. To make this idea clearer, consider another scenario. Imagine a robot programmed to respond to lies with a warning light. If the robot says, "The warning light will now activate," and the light turns on, it implies the robot was lying. But if the robot was lying, then the light should not have turned on because the statement was false. Like the Pinocchio paradox, This scenario demonstrates how rules tied to self-referential conditions can lead to logical dead ends. The paradox also raises questions about how we define truth and lies. In Pinocchio's case, his nose growing is a physical consequence tied to a moral concept, lying. When he lies, his nose grows. But what happens when the concept of lying becomes tangled in logical contradictions? The paradox challenges the simplicity of defining truth and falsehood as binary opposites. Instead, it reveals how certain situations blur the lines between the two. This idea has real-world implications in fields like philosophy, linguistics, and computer science. For instance, in programming, self-referential loops can cause software to crash or produce errors. These loops are known as infinite regressions, where a system keeps referencing itself without reaching a resolution. Similarly, in mathematics, certain problems are undecidable, meaning they cannot be resolved within the framework of the system they belong to. The Pinocchio Paradox is a playful example of these deeper issues, illustrating how simple rules can lead to complex outcomes. Another layer to the paradox involves the concept of identity and agency. Pinocchio is not just a puppet, he's a character with his own thoughts and actions. By saying, "My nose will grow now," he's making a prediction about the future based on his understanding of the rule governing his nose. But if that prediction creates a paradox, does it mean Pinocchio is acting outside the rule, or does it mean the rule itself is incomplete? This question touches on the limitations of systems that rely on absolute rules to govern behavior. The paradox also invites us to think about the nature of storytelling and logic. In a fictional world, Pinocchio's nose is governed by magical logic rather than physical laws. This gives the paradox a unique twist, as it combines the imaginative world of fairy tales with the rigid structure of logical reasoning. By doing so, it highlights the tension between creativity and consistency. Fiction allows for bending rules, but even fictional worlds can encounter problems when they introduce self-referential systems. In some ways, the Pinocchio paradox mirrors the challenges we face in understanding complex systems in the real world. Whether it's the behavior of subatomic particles in quantum physics or the ethical dilemmas of artificial intelligence, many problems resist simple solutions. These problems often involve feedback loops, uncertainty, and contradictions, much like the paradox. By exploring the Pinocchio paradox, we gain a better appreciation for how logic interacts with uncertainty, even in whimsical scenarios. Interestingly, the paradox doesn't have a clear resolution, and that's part of its appeal. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding and the boundaries of logical reasoning. While it may not have practical applications, it sparks curiosity and encourages creative thinking. It also serves as a reminder that even seemingly simple questions can lead to profound insights. For example, what does it mean for Pinocchio to lie? If he says something he believes to be true, but it turns out to be false, does his nose grow? Or does the rule only apply when he intentionally says something false? This distinction between intention and outcome adds another layer of complexity to the paradox. It shows how even the definition of a lie can depend on context and interpretation. The Pinocchio paradox also invites us to think about the relationship between language and reality. Pinocchio's statement, "My nose will grow now," is a prediction, but it's also a declaration that influences the outcome. In a sense, his words shape reality, much like how language shapes our understanding of the world. This interplay between words and actions is central to many philosophical debates, from the nature of truth to the power of speech. In the end, the Pinocchio paradox is less about finding an answer and more about exploring the questions it raises. It reminds us that logic, while powerful, is not always straightforward. Sometimes the most interesting ideas are those that defy easy explanation. By engaging with these paradoxes, we learn to think more deeply, question assumptions, and embrace the complexity of the world around us. The story of Pinocchio may be a fairy tale, but the paradox it inspires is a timeless puzzle that continues to intrigue and challenge us.